Hey guys, sorry I am almost 15 minutes late. It's really getting out of hand, but at least it's going to be a good show. Behind me is a photo that I actually took in Nuenen in the Netherlands. Behind me over this shoulder is the house that Vincent van Gogh stayed in. And yeah. Kitty's just having a sip of water. Okay, Kitty also need to drink the water. Okay, so that's that. And then this is a photo of Cafeteria Van Gogh, one of the sites in, or one of the watering holes in Nuenen. I'll take you guys through a lot more. I first want to let you guys know what is going to be happening in this episode. So something quite cool has happened with the weaver. Remember I mentioned the weaver bird? That's what I've actually been spending the last 5 minutes doing. I sort of remembered, oh crap, I've taken some photos. I'm going to need to upload them and transfer them. And so that was what sort of gobbled up a little bit of time. So I'm going to share that with you, and it does believe it or not, it does have a bearing on the story of Van Gogh, particularly this episode 26. And then I'm also going to take you through visiting Nuenen and a couple of other photos that I think are to some extent relevant, including a very up-close photo of a Van Gogh painting. So I'm going to zoom in to within like a really, really short, small area to show you the impasto style of Van Gogh from very, very up close. And this is a taste of what's to come. I've obviously got a lot more photos that I took following in the footsteps of Vincent van Gogh. So this is just really dealing with Nuenen and a couple of other things. But yeah, so that's that aspect. The other thing that I think is quite interesting is, and a bit of a surprise, I think, for you guys, is I will be jumping ahead. Where is it? Is it here? So I will be jumping ahead to the second half of September 1884 in terms of the letters. I don't know if you guys remember, we were due to start off on I think it was the 1st of February. So we are literally jumping forward 8 months, right? So bit of a surprise. Yeah, I guess you guys didn't expect that. But there is method behind this madness. You may not think so, but there definitely is. Okay, so before I kind of get going, I just want to see who's here and so on. So Paddy, Sharon, Tuck. Sharon, I did get your messages on Instagram. Thanks a lot for that. I see we've got a few new Patreons, a few new members as well. Ricardo, good to see you here. Welcome to the VIP lounge, Ricardo. And yeah, so there are a couple of you also who have voted. And I see some of you have voted for a butcher, some for a baker, some for a candlestick maker. So let me put you guys into the picture here. Just to remind you where we were. Do you remember in the last episode, we found that Vincent had sort of reconciled himself to his family. It finally sort of made peace with dad and mom. You know, he was no longer the shaggy dog. Do you remember that? Do you remember that there was also even a sense that I'm gonna leave again. I can't live like this. I'm gonna go back to scene. Right? Do you remember all of that? And that was all resolved because basically of an accident. His mother fell. His mother slipped, I think, getting off a train, and actually it was quite a serious fall. She hurt her hip, I think she even fractured her hip. And as a result of that, Vincent is now kind of indispensable. He's sort of, what's the word? He is very much needed. He's needed to carry his mother around to some extent. Bear in mind, she's pretty much immobile. And so Vincent's fortunes have suddenly changed. He's now not the shaggy dog. He's now very much wanted and needed around the house. Right? So that's where we are. So guess what happens between then, that's January 1884, and September 1884. Guess what happens in that period of time? Right? So I'm going to give you guys a hint by going into some of the photos that I've just sent to myself here. I'm going to give you guys a hint at what changes. What is the change between February and September, right? And so let's bring this up. So, so this is that weaver bird. These are actually raw, unedited photos, so they're a little bit rough, and I could have selected maybe some better ones. This is the weaver bird, and guess what? We're all in for a little bit of a surprise. Good guess, Paddy. Good guess. So, guess what is going on with this weaver bird? Just a couple of photos there. He's sort of doing his little fluttering and so on. He's actually started building a second nest. Can you believe it? And what do you think that means? Why do you think the weaver bird is building two nests? What do you think that's all about? So this is the work going on in the second nest. There you get a bit of an idea of it. You can see him actually inside the nest here. Right there you can see his hard at work. And if you don't believe me, okay, there he is again working on the nest. If you think it's still one nest, I do have a couple of photos where you can see both nests in the same picture. There it is. There you can see both nests. This over here is believe it or not, is a sparrow's nest, this huge monstrosity here. So this weaver, this enterprising little bird, is now decided to kind of double or nothing, right? So why do you think he's why do you think he's making two nests? What do you think that's all about? Any ideas? Any thoughts on why this bird has built two nests? Yeah, Tommy says looking for a mate. Well, actually, he's looking for two mates. He's looking to have two families at the same time with two different ladybirds, right? So, no, it's not his and her home. So he is actually hoping to have a very busy summer and have a pretty cool summer romance. That's his plan, right? And we'll see whether he builds a third nest and even more, right? So that's really his plan. Is like, one wife for me is not good enough. I'm gonna make myself a very eligible bachelor. I'm gonna make a few homes, kind of thing, right? So that is a little bit of a clue into what is going on with Vincent van Gogh, right? What's going on with Vincent van Gogh? Well, now that he's nicely settled at home, guess what he has got in mind, right? Well, the answer is that he is going to be up to his old tricks, I guess you could say. He's going to be falling in love with his neighbor, and the neighbor is actually the pastor's daughter, believe it or not. So Vincent is the son of a pastor, and the neighbor is the daughter of a pastor. And I think there's an 11-year age gap. She's 43, he's 32, something like that, right? And yeah, so that's some intertextuality for you. And so you can imagine what are the parents of these respective individuals going to say about this. And let me kind of jump the gun a little bit and just say, how does this happen? Well, how it happens is obviously Vincent, who's fallen out of favor to some extent, falls back into favor. But the other aspect to it is he's now at home quite a lot. He's not banished to some room out there. He's actually needed inside the home and sort of around women, including his mother. Now, one of the things that his mother had to sort of give up after getting injured was she was giving, I think, sewing classes, right? She was literally teaching other ladies sewing. So I guess they were earning a little bit of an income from that. I've got a neighbor who teaches piano lessons. And so this is what she was doing. And so instead of just losing that income and losing those customers, she solicited the help of the next door neighbor, and that was Margot Begemann. And so Margot comes over, and Margot is going to be really sweet and do Mrs. Van Gogh's sewing classes on behalf of Mr. Van Gogh. But guess what? That means she's going to be coming and going every single day. And guess who she's going to be sort of passing in the hall? And guess who's going to get a little idea? You know, who's going to get some naughty ideas, right? Amy, good to see you. Paddy says finally a correct answer from me. Okay, so that is really how all of this happens. And we're not going through that. So in other words, we're not going through the whole process of going through February, March, April, May, June, July, August letters, because Vincent actually keeps that a secret as well. So once again, sort of in the spring/summer, but I guess more the spring of 1884, within this whole context of all is well at home, Vincent secretly starts something with the neighbor. And the part that is quite fascinating is that actually the neighbor falls in love with him. So far, you've kind of got the sense that Kivos wasn't particularly interested. I think calling her a cold fish is putting it mildly. She was really not interested. I think Scene was somewhat, what's the word? I don't know if the word is accessible or available, but she was a little bit more well disposed towards the artist. But this woman is a lot more into Vincent van Gogh, and you could make the argument, I don't know if I quite believe it, but you could make the argument that this is the only woman to ever fall in love with Vincent van Gogh, to fall head over heels with him. And as usual, there's sort of a dramatic conclusion when, once again, the families interfere. This time it's her turn to go a little bit crazy. And I think the fact that she goes crazy and drinks strychnine, and we're going to deal with Vincent's letter about that, the fact that she is so overwrought, I think in a way conceals the fact that Vincent's not that overwrought. So you kind of get this feeling that Vincent's becoming a bit of a playboy. He saw his opportunity, he took it, he had a little bit of a summer fling, he broke her heart. Well, that's the new Vincent van Gogh. I'm going to be a bit of a player now. And from here, he's going to go and take this repertoire with him to Paris, to all, and so on. Does that make sense? So I hope I provided a good backstory in plus minus 10 minutes. If you're late and you've missed it, unfortunately, you've kind of missed the boat. As Paddy says, never a dull moment in Vincent's life. I do think you've got to feel a little bit of a sense that Vincent is in a way an author of his own troubles, in a way, Right. So before we get started on this letter, I want you to at least consider that everything is sort of sorted out. And then Vincent decides once again to, what's the word? Philander. You know, his family are finally settled and everything's fine. And then what does he do with their trust? Well, we're about to find out. So before we get to that, I want to share with you some other photos I've taken of the residents in Nuenen. So there's another one. Let me blow it up sort of almost full screen. Let me do, is it that? Right. So I'm obviously in Nuenen and I'm thinking of trying to interpret all of this in an artistic sense. So that's why I took this particular photo, just looking at these patterns. And, you know, did Vincent get the idea of those energy lines from these bricks, this brickwork? You know, or is that just a coincidence? Look at those lines there as well. You know, did Vincent ever look at his own home and think, wow, look at how it is composed, right? So yeah, so that was one thing that I noticed. So that is the roof of the family home in Nuenen, basically the parsonage. Here's another image. You can see it's actually quite a spacious residence. There's the home. This is sort of a, I don't know whether you want to call it a shed or sort of a guest house. There's another building, quite a big garden. Not bad for sort of middle class folks. I mean, you know, if you had to live in that, I think you'd call it a mansion. I mean, it's almost the size of Graceland, right? Do you agree? So there's another angle from the outside. There, once again, you see these smallish bricks, creepers, and so on. Another angle. Again, I'm just looking at these lines and wondering, did some of this influence the way, consciously or subconsciously, the way that he eventually painted? You know, a house is constructed of all of these lines. This is a sort of tourist perspective. So if you walking on the sidewalk, then you would see something like this, and I think you can press a button or you can scan your phone, and then you'll get a little bit of a, you know, some backstory. But this is basically what you see from the sort of exterior, the sort of the roadside, basically. And you have these sort of signs all over the place. So there's the background image for today's episode. You can see it's a pretty big house. Like I said, it reminds you a little bit of Graceland, doesn't it? You don't really get the sense that Vincent's poor when you look at this particular photo, do you? This is a closer up image, and I'm trying to stress that, you know, Elvis Presley was incredibly wealthy, and look at how Vincent's parents were living, right? So bear in mind, this house isn't there. It's given to them by sort of the, I guess, the church fathers, or it belongs to the church, but nevertheless they're living pretty comfortably. And you can see, when you sort of look at this house, you can see it speaks of respectability. Do you agree with that? It all seems very respectable. And can you imagine a guy who is dirty and his clothes are a mess and is having an affair with the neighbor's daughter? You know, can you imagine that person living in this house? So there's another image as well. And as far as I know, what it says here is, please don't ring the bell. I don't think you're really allowed you can't just go in there. We'll deal with all of this a bit later, but this is a cafe called De Aardappel Eaters, which means the potato eaters, right? Which is a bit of a play on the painting that he painted. Okay, so this is just another attraction in Nuenen. To be honest, I'm not quite sure what this is about. Is that building supposed to be that? Because it doesn't look like that at all. So I'm not quite sure what this is all about. It's quite a strange building with a thatch roof on top of a shingle roof. Quite bizarre, isn't it? So these are some other photos I took during my walk through Nuenen. That's a sign. Notice the signage is yellow and blue, and then there it says Van Gogh Kerkje, which means a small Van Gogh church, and then Gemeentehuis, which means I guess the parsonage, right? So we're gonna deal with that a little bit later, more photos and so on. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to get back to the letter. Let's get started with the letter. Okay, so there we are. Okay, so it's written in the second half of September 1884. We're jumping ahead about 6-7 months, and it's to Theo, and we don't have the exact date, but it's the second half of September, right? And what I want you to think about is how some elements of where we left off are still there, and now some are changed. Bear in mind, we are moving on as though it's just the next letter, but 8 months, 7-8 months worth of letters have gone by. He's obviously evolved in that time as an artist. So don't forget about that. In the same way that his affair has evolved, that he's had this relationship and lots of things have been happening. Other things have happened as well, like his art has evolved. His relationship with his brother has evolved in some ways as well, right? Gathering place, good to see you. Gathering place, if you're a bit unsure what's going on, you might want to listen to the first 22 minutes again a little bit later. Okay, so let's get going. So he writes, Dear Theo, you're perfectly right in asking me why I haven't answered you yet, right? And so that's already telling you, whoa, something is up. Because Vincent usually writes regularly, and Theo is the one that's a little tardy, right? And so he says, I certainly did receive your letter with the enclosed 150 francs. So that's how much money Theo is sending him, quite a lot of money, right? And so even though Theo sent him a lot of money, Vincent just doesn't write him back. Well, there's a reason for it. Crisis, drama, catastrophe, in fact. He says, I began writing to you, especially to thank you for evidently having understood my letter, and then to say that I only count on 100 francs, though I can hardly manage on it as long as I do not sell. But nevertheless, if it is 100 francs, there are 50 francs more than I counted on. So I must say, given what is about to follow in this letter, I think it's quite crazy that he starts off sort of talking about money. I think it's really just pretty incredible that that's what he sort of kicks off with here, right? So then he says, we arranged in The Hague, I only need 100 francs. So he's actually telling his brother, stop sending me so much money, I don't need so much money. And then he says, if we are only partly good friends, I should not want to accept more. So that's also a little bit of an indication, well, things are not totally hunky-dory with Theo, right? And here we come to it. I could not finish that letter, however, and since then I've wanted to write you, but simply couldn't. Something terrible has happened, Theo, which hardly anybody here knows or suspects or may ever know. So for heaven's sake, keep it to yourself. To tell you everything, I should have to write a book. I can't do it. Well, what that is telling you is we're about to deal with big sort of stories here, big gossip. Vincent has once again got himself into a mess, hasn't he? Right? He's saying, I've got to write, if I had to tell you about the, Playboy antics I've been up to for the past couple of months, I would have to write a book about it. And it's a pity that he didn't. But he says, and now he reveals, this is the big reveal. He says, Margot Begemann took poison in a moment of despair after she had a discussion with her family. So he's now admitting to his brother that there's someone called Margot Begemann in his life, and she has now been outed as Vincent's girlfriend. In fact, they want to get married, and she's so upset that she tried to end her life. She feels slandered, she feels humiliated, just like Vincent felt. And they want to get married, they want to do what they want to do, but once again, their stern, respectively, their stern parents are like, no, 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 this is unacceptable. You will not do that, etc. She became so upset with what her family said to her that she, took, I think, strychnine. Then he goes on to say to Theo, I had already consulted with a doctor once about certain symptoms of her. So it's a weird parallel universe to Scene with Vincent. Sorry, with Scene, Vincent was trying to get her to a doctor and trying to take care of her. Well, now he's got a woman who is once again almost on the brink of life and death, and it's up to Vincent to save her, but he's kind of the cause of it. He says, 3 days before, I'd secretly warned her brother, so there's a lot of intrigue going on here, that I was afraid she would get brain fever, and that I was sorry to state that in my eyes, the Begemann family acted extremely imprudently. And so you've got once again Vincent hanging around and doing whatever he's doing, and you've got these disapproving families. This is now the third family, essentially. We had the Strickers with Kivos, you had his own family with Scene, and now you've got the Begemann family who are very upset about this as well. And think about it, you've got this respectable family next door. The Van Goghs are respectable, but who would have thought that their eldest son is such a bozo? So he says, you know what, I tried to lecture the brother, but it had no effect, at least no other than that they told me to wait 2 years, which I decidedly refused to do, saying that if there was a question of marriage, it had to be very soon or not at all. So can you see here, Vincent is calling the shots. He's saying, the family are saying, okay, so when you get married, okay, let's see what happens in 2 years. Are you going to make a success as an artist? Are you going to make any money? I mean, you don't even have a home. You're living with your parents. You're a 32-year-old loser that's failed to launch. And, can you look after our daughter? So we're going to give you 2 years to prove himself. And Vincent says, no ways. He says, I decidedly refuse to do so. He's saying, no, 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 no. I love your daughter. She loves me. We're getting married now, not later, right now. So you can see how Vincent's become quite a difficult fellow, to put it mildly. So Sharon says, poor Margot, they were adults. Yes and no. I don't know if one can say that Vincent is an adult. I mean, he's an adult in terms of age, but is he an adult in terms of temperament? Can you say that someone who doesn't have a job is an adult? You might say, yes, someone without a job is an adult. Okay, so is someone who doesn't have a job and lives at home an adult? Right? It's a good point from Tommy. Tommy says, Tommy says, so Theo is still sending Vincent money even when he was living with his parents. Yeah. So that kind of shows you Theo's either a glutton for punishment or a very, very kind brother, a very, very generous brother. But you can also see it from the perspective of Theo thinks his brother is going to make it eventually as an artist, wrongly as it turns out, in terms of his lifetime. But the whole idea is that Theo's going to be Theo's going to be receiving art and then hopefully selling it. And if Theo, excuse me, if Theo sells Vincent's art, then Vincent's sort of off his back. Then Vincent can start earning his own living. So Theo is in a way both the solution to Vincent and the problem, right? Theo feels like I've got to help Vincent establish himself. And if I can't make that happen, then I'm going to have to pay for Vincent. That's sort of the situation. But you've got to think that, thank goodness Theo did that, because as a result of Theo's strange and strangely unconditional generosity, Vincent ended up painting fruitlessly for almost a decade. And that's why we've got the artwork of Vincent van Gogh today, right? Thanks to Theo's generosity, the way was paved for Vincent to only to paint with nothing to show for it. So anyway, he goes on to say, well, Theo, you have read, I guess this is a book. Do you remember the first Madame who died in a nervous attack? Here it was something like that, but complicated by her having taken poison. So this neighbor's daughter literally tried to take her own life. That's pretty dramatic. Can you imagine if she died, right? And then he talks about what was going on, and you can imagine that her and Vincent often walked together anyway. They often, while his mother was stuck in a chair, he would start going for walks with this young lady, and obviously something happened. Anyway, he says, when we were quietly walking together, she had often said, I wish I could die now. I'd never paid any attention to it. And one wonders what she meant by that. Did she mean, I'm so happy to be with you, Vincent. You're such a happy-go-lucky chap. You're so charming. I love your sort of rustic attire. I could just die now and go to heaven. Is that what she meant? Anyway, then he describes, one morning she slipped to the ground. At first I thought it was just a weakness, but it got worse and worse. Spasms. She lost her power of speech and mumbled all kind of things that were only half intelligible. She collapsed completely with many jerks and convulsions and so on. Now, what's quite strange is it feels like we've gone from Elvis's strange apoplexy, to do with mountains of drugs, to something else like, whatever it is, 150 years ago. And what was the cause of all this? He says, it was different from an epileptic fit, though there was a great similarity. And suddenly I grew suspicious and I said, did you happen to swallow something? She screamed, yes. Well, then I took matters in hand. She insisted on my swearing that I should never tell anybody. I said, that's all right. I'll swear anything you like, but only on condition that you throw that stuff up immediately. So put your finger down your throat until you vomit, or else I'll call the others. Well, you understand the rest. So I suppose you could argue that Vincent actually saves her life. He says, that vomiting succeeded only partially. So I went to her brother Louis and told him what the matter was and got her an emetic. And I went immediately to Eindhoven to Dr. van der Loo. Now, what is quite interesting here is that they go to Eindhoven. Now, remember, Eindhoven is where the colonel's sister found out about her brother being Elvis's manager. Do you remember that was in Eindhoven? Well, this is how close they are to that. So Vincent and so they go to this doctor in Eindhoven, and the reason they do that is because they don't want to go to a local doctor. They don't want there to be a scandal. They're trying to keep this a secret. It's the same thing. It's the same PR deal with the Elvis story here all over again, right? Someone's life's in danger, but we're not going to just take her to a doctor. We're going to take her to a doctor far away and, sort it out over there, right? And then he provides some detail that she took strychnine. He says it was strychnine, but the dose must have been too small, or perhaps she took chloroform or laudanum with it as a narcotic, which would be very counter poison against strychnine. In short, she took the counter poison which the doctor prescribed in time. She was at once sent off to a doctor in Utrecht, so that's somewhere else, and he's said to have gone abroad. I think it probable that she will get entirely well again. So if I understand this correctly, she's already gone. She's not even in the country anymore. So there was this big scandal, and now, if I understand this right, and now she's basically left the country completely to keep the fallout, to keep the bad press to a minimum. Then he says, I think it probable that she will get entirely well again, but I'm afraid a long period of nervous suffering will follow. In what form, more or less serious, that is the question. So do you notice how, in a weird way, how matter of fact Vincent actually is? Someone who loved him so much is now trying to take her own life, and you don't really hear him saying he's in big distress. He actually acts quite practically. He acts quite, almost like a medic. He sort of does quite well in that sense. Then he says, she's well taken care of now. You will understand how low I have felt since this accident. Okay, so there's some admission. He says, it was a terrible fright, my boy. We were alone in the fields when it happened, but fortunately the poison has at least lost its effect by now. But for heaven's sake, what should we think of that standing and of that religion which the respectable people believe in? Oh, they are perfectly absurd, making society a kind of lunatic asylum, a perfectly topsy-turvy world. Oh, that mysticism. So here, on the heels of this eventuality, Vincent is railing a little bit against the regimental society that he belongs to. And your heart's kind of got to go out to him a little bit. He says, living in a society with these strictures is like being in a lunatic asylum. He's saying it's mad. He says, you will understand how everything passed through my mind these last few days, and how absorbed I was in the sad story. Now that she has tried this and failed, I think it has given her such a fright that she will not readily try it a second time. The failure of a suicide is the best remedy against a future suicide. But if she gets brain fever or nervous fever, then. Now, what is quite interesting is here Vincent is commenting about somebody else committing suicide. He saves her. He also talks about, I don't think she's going to try and do it again, right? Is that a reflection on his own thoughts about suicide? If he said, I'm pretty sure she's going to try suicide again, you might almost think that he was somewhat predisposed to the idea himself. But you kind of get the idea that he doesn't think it's and he's been shocked by the reality of it, right? At quite a young age. So he goes on to say, but she has been doing rather well these first days. I'm just afraid of bad consequences. Theo, my boy, I'm so upset by it. Goodbye, right soon, for I speak to nobody here. Adieu, Vincent. So quite an interesting letter, isn't it? I do want to just emphasize before we go into the next letter, the fact that he says here, I've got to tell you something terrible. Hardly anybody here knows or suspects or may ever know. So for heaven's sake, keep it to yourself. There's a little bit of a glimpse into the inner world of the Van Gogh family and Vincent in particular. They do keep certain secrets. They don't always talk about things that are happening. Vincent only reveals this affair when it has reached this terrible denouement, right? So now he also writes to Anton van Rappard. Amice Rappard, I wrote you today in your letter from Terschelling crossed mine. I'm greatly pleased to hear what you're going to bring back, that you are going to bring back rather a lot of things from your trip. From what you say about your studies, I'm confident that you will bring along useful things. I still regret that I've not seen that picture, Fish Market, even in its first stage. So you can anticipate now that we're going to get a little bit of insight and backstory into Vincent's art journey. You know, he's writing to a fellow artist. You think he's going to mention Margot van Begemann to this guy, who's kind of is not in the inner circle of the Van Gogh family. So what's quite interesting to see is how the tone of this letter and the content of this letter differs from the one we've just gone through. So he says, so now he's talking about art. He says, if you keep the division of the space substantially as it is now, it is my opinion that it can be saved only by division of light and brown, a vigorous effect of chiaroscuro. I'm not quite sure what that is. It may apply to something quite different, may flatly contradict your intention. He goes on to say, I suppose your sketch conforms to the picture with regard to the amount of canvas space taken up by your figures as compared to the canvas space taken up by the houses, streets, sky. And then it struck me at once that the figures would be crushed by the rest, and that there would be too much of a struggle between the figures and the surroundings. Now, just coincidentally, at the beginning of this episode, I showed you pictures of houses, street, sky. And one wonders again how much he stared at that and looked at things like that. Then he says, well, I'm damn sorry I didn't see the picture itself in its first stage. All the same, I did not lose sight of the fact, as you suppose, that it is you who are making the picture, not I. But I base my argument on something you will hardly deny, namely that you are making a picture. And a picture, whoever the artist may be, you or anyone else, should express preferably one thing only, and that quite clearly. Speaking of Van der Wiel, I remember saying to him about the picture which he got a medal for, sorry, in Amsterdam, and this contrary to the opinion of others, that I greatly appreciated his having succeeded so well in preserving the unity of style in all caps, despite all the different things that appeared in it. And that is really and truly, it really and truly was a picture, something quite different from a realistic study from nature. He goes on to say, it's not really a very long letter. He says, after all, I know nothing of your original concept except from that hasty little sketch. He talks about, I'm afraid that your foreground, for instance, cannot carry all the things standing in it. So what you have here are two artists that are sort of criticizing one another's work, commenting on one another's work, reviewing one another's work. And you're going to see not too long from now, I suppose that's relative, but relatively not too far from now, Rappard is going to provide his own opinion on Van Gogh's painting, The Potato Eaters, and that's going to cause a big explosion as well. Rappard's going to say, dude, what is going on here? Like, are you serious in the modern vernacular, right? So this is Vincent kind of saying, I don't know what you were trying to do in the foreground. He says, this very summer, the same thing happened to me with a weaver's interior that I could not go on with because the whole thing came too much to the forefront, because the picture began with what ought to have been the second plane. I reproached myself in the same way that I'm now speaking to you. So in a nutshell, he's reproaching Rappard. He's saying, I don't like what you did here. You made a mess of your picture. And so when Van Rappard speaks his mind about Vincent, you're going to see what happens. Vincent doesn't seem to mind criticizing other people, but when he gets criticized, oopsie. Anyway, he says, it is something that happens very often to nearly all painters, and it may happen that it can be remedied only by transferring the whole to a larger canvas. By the way, do you know Ordered Off by Frank Hall in the London News? I bought it back from Utrecht together with A Shepherd by Thompson. Goodbye. I hope you will come in October if possible. If possible, write in advance the exact date when you're coming. I think he's saying give the exact date so that we know how to sort out the current, things that are taking place here. Tommy says Vincent painted 175 paintings in the 2 years he spent in Nuenen. Quite amazing, isn't it? And then he signs off his letter. Now, like I said, did you really expect he was going to mention Margot Begemann to Van Rappard, right? And this is quite important because there's a time where Vincent is living with another artist, Paul Gauguin, in Arles, and and even preceding that, he writes to Paul Gauguin, and that's where you see there are two sides to Vincent. There are things he says to Paul Gauguin about women, about whatever, and he doesn't say those things to Theo, right? Although that's not rocket science, you nevertheless realize Vincent's not a cardboard cutout character. He is, quite a complicated person, and he only shows certain sides of himself to certain people, and also when he's ready to do that. So now we go back to Theo, Vincent's letter to Theo, and now once again the narrative returns to this what's happened to this unfortunate woman, right? And so he says, Dear Theo, just a word to let you know that I've been to Utrecht to visit her. I also had an interview with a physician with whom she's staying because I wanted to get his advice as to what I must or must not do for the sake of the patient's health and future, either continue our relation or break it off. In this matter, I want no other advice except that of a physician. So can you imagine if the physician said, in order to preserve the life of this woman, you absolutely must marry her. In order to save this lady, Vincent, we need you to, you've got to put a ring on that lady's finger. It's got to happen immediately. We've got no time to waste. Can you imagine if that happened? Do you think that would have been wise advice? He says, I have heard that her health is greatly shaken, though she's recovering. So I must say that I'm not 100% sure whether she's in the country now, or whether it was the doctor that left. I mean, if he says, I've been to Utrecht to visit her, then she's obviously still in the country. Anyway, we'll deal with that. We'll deal with that in terms of some of these biographies. Well, I guess we might as well deal with this right now. This comes from vincentvangoghgallery.com, and it just says, and it's quite interesting how this is not strictly speaking accurate. It says, I'll put a link to this in the chat so you guys can check it out. It just says that in 1884, Vincent's mother injured her leg, and Vincent returned to Nuenen to help her during her convalescence. Do you think that that is accurate? Did Mrs. Van Gogh hurt herself and then Vincent moved back home? Is that accurate? Anyway, it goes on to say, during that time, she received frequent visits from Margot Begemann, the youngest daughter of the family that lived next door. So she's 43, but the youngest daughter. They became friends, went on long walks together. She was the only woman to really love Vincent. She says this, or it's written here, this love was unrequited. And it seems like it's a combination of Vincent not really loving her back, even though he's saying he maybe wants to marry her. He didn't really love her back. She loved him. He was somewhat indifferent towards her. And then she got a lot of pressure from her own family, and this sort of drove her over the edge, right? So she actually had a dream of marrying Vincent. And again, one's got to wonder what would have happened if that took place. So that's that. This is from a Wikipedia on Margot Begemann, and we might as well deal with that right now. I'll just put a link to that. She was born in March 1841 in Nuenen. She had a love affair with the painter Vincent van Gogh in the summer of 1884, which resulted in the attempted suicide of Margot. So she was the daughter of an evangelical reformed pastor, Willem Lodewijk Begemann. And it's quite weird that you've got them, both these pastors, living next door to one another. Margot was born in the local pastor's house at Berg 26 and spent half of her life there. Today, the building is called Van Gogh House. So the house that Margot lived in, Van Gogh was now living in. So the house that Margot grew up in was a pastorage which was basically handed over to the new pastor. Does that make sense? But you can imagine her feeling comfortable with the whole situation. You know, almost like these people living in a home that she used to live in, you know, would make her feel quite comfortable. Pastor Theodorus van Gogh worked there from 1882 to 1885. So it says the family of Pastor Begemann lived from 1875 in House Berg 24 next door. 1875, so around about 7 years. Pastor Begemann had the house built towards the end of his term of office in order to move in with his wife and unmarried daughters after he retired. So you kind of get the idea, the reason why you've got all of these, you sort of got these other structures is for his daughters. I'm talking about that building and that building. Does that make sense? The reason why you've got these two structures is so that he could accommodate his unmarried daughters as well, right? Seems like he didn't really mind his daughters not being married either. So anyway, this is why Margot, or Go, is sometimes referred to as the daughter of a neighbor in Vincent van Gogh's biographies. The pastor, her father died in 1876. His wife a few months later in January 1877. Neither of them lived to see Pastor Theodorus. So that is, I guess, why Van Gogh's dad came into the whole story. It was because both her parents died, right? So the other thing to bear in mind is she doesn't really have guardians. She's the youngest daughter, and you know, she probably felt like, I want to be married, I want to belong to some kind of family, and I don't really see my family as my siblings or my sisters, right? You've also got to wonder who were the family of hers that were disapproving of her. If both her parents had died, I guess it could be aunts, uncles, older brothers and sisters. We know that Vincent speaks to one of her brothers. Anyway, it's interesting that it says here their relationship developed in the spring. So it wasn't a short-lived relationship. It wasn't um, just, let's say, bear in mind, she takes this poison in September, so that's already autumn. But so it's obviously almost like a 4, 5, maybe even 6 month affair. Maybe it started in March. Remember, Vincent's mother hurt herself in January. By February, everything was sorted out. So maybe they actually met and things started happening in March 1884. So March, April, May, June, July, August. So that's almost 6 months. It says that Vincent's mother had a broken leg. Actually, she had a broken hip, but that is the circumstances under which they met. Um, Margot often accompanied Vincent in his painting studies, and I think he must have painted her as well. You can imagine that he asked her to pose for him, and that she found that quite interesting. Maybe she even found it quite romantic. Um, then it says expressions by Vincent and Margot that they wanted to get married met resistance from both families. Why? Because Vincent wasn't able to provide for a family and his reputation in the village was low. Thanks a lot, Susan. Susan says, if Vincent was allowed to marry her, would he have to get a job to support her and stop painting? It's a good question. I think the way Vincent would have saw it is, I have a job. I'm a painter. It's just a matter of time before I sell a painting. Well, you can imagine, as bold and confident as that sounds, if you are on the sidelines, you're going to say, sorry, we need something better than that. We need some proof. We need we need to see that you can look after your wife, kind of thing. So I do think what they would have wanted is, this whole idea of wait 2 years. I think it was like, well, prove that you can sell your art in 2 years, and that was never going to happen. And if Vincent did accept that, the end result would have been that he couldn't prove that. The other part of this particular statement here, which I think is really interesting, is his reputation in the village was low. Why do you think that was? Do you think Margot was the only person he was wolf whistling at? Um, you really had a 31-year-old, 32-year-old, well, at this point, 31-year-old, who was sort of hanging around, and he was a bit of a low life, and he was staring at people, and he thought, what I'm doing is perfectly normal. I'm an artist. But other people thought, this guy's weird. Also, he keeps inviting sort of strange blue collar folk to paint, and does he sometimes ask them to take off their clothes, kind of thing. Um, that does actually come up. I'm not exaggerating. This whole thing of he was painting portraits and then having affairs with some of those people that he was painting, and when that started happening in the congregation, people were very upset. So yeah, so there was also an age difference that they didn't like, and so years is actually is the question I had is answered. She came under pressure from her older sister, so it's a little bit like Cinderella, the disapproving older sister sort of ruining it. Okay, so I'm not going to take that any further. And then there's this particular set of photos from TripAdvisor, and you can just see this is the house that she grew up in. It's kind of, sorry, not grew up in. lived in while all of this was happening, I guess. You can see it's quite a lot more modest. And there you can see it's right next door to the house that Vincent was living in. And this is the other side of the Nuenen home. There you can see what it looks like. Dat says, hier woonde en werkte Vincent van Gogh van 1883 tot 1885. And what that means is, hier woonde means here, or here lived and worked Vincent van Gogh, to make a direct translation. That's one of the things he painted from this particular perspective. So just a couple of images worth looking at. Okay. So in terms of, like, although he's not madly in love with her, he is kind of thinking, I think I'm going to marry her. She wants to marry me. Well, I think I'm going to marry her. And so, yeah, Paddy, good point. Paddy says, just like the reaction of the people in Hull. So you might say, I like Vincent van Gogh. I think he's cute. I think he's, his troubled, or his difficult personality is just really quaint, and I find him a hoot. Well, the people around him didn't. The people around him found him a pain in the butt, right? Tommy says, do you think Margot took the poison to get Vincent's attention, possibly because he wasn't giving her enough attention? She took the poison with him. It's a possibility. I don't know if I agree with that. I think the one side of it is, you could say she didn't take enough, but he forced her to vomit it out. So if she didn't vomit it out, what would have happened? I think she could have died, right, in theory. Okay, so let's go on with this letter. So he's saying, I want no other advice than that of a physician. Must I marry Margot, yes or no? He says, I've heard that her health is greatly shaken. She's recovering. Sorry, according to the doctor who's known her from childhood and who's also a mother's physician, she has always had a very frail constitution and will always have. Sorry, that for the moment there are two dangerous things. That she's too weak to marry, at least for the moment, but at the same time, a separation would be too dangerous too. So it's like doctor's orders, don't break up with her, but don't marry her either. Complicated, isn't it? He says, so sometime will have to pass, and then I shall receive a definite hint of what will be best for her, separation or not. Of course, I shall always remain her friend. Mutually, we are perhaps too much attached to each other. Do you see how you don't really get a sense that he's head over heels? He says, I spent almost the whole day with her then. You do get a sense that Vincent is quite a loyal guy to people that he likes, people that he's well disposed towards. I went to see Rappard for a moment, but he wasn't in town. Last week, I made a sketch for the last of the 6 pictures for Hermans, wood gatherers in the snow. Just bring this up a bit bigger. So he has all 6 of them to copy. When he has finished this one and they are thoroughly dry, I shall work them up into pictures. I wish you could see all 6 of them together in the panels for which they are destined. His copies are very correct as to the drawing, but I think his color is bad. As for mine, the warm gray, often bituminous tone, in which I kept the whole thing, harmonizes with the woodwork and the style of the room. Goodbye. You should not have the impression that what you write, that it is evident she's like an angel of patience, is correct. So that is obviously a verbatim quote from Theo's letter. He's saying, is saying that the doctor actually said she has always had a highly irritable temper. So it seems like this pastor's daughter is quite a agitated, high-strung person. I don't want to say histrionic, but certainly very emotional, I guess. He says, I do not think it impossible or improbable that you, sooner or later, when you put your theory on marriage into practice yourself, Theo, that is to say, after you have gained a nice, secure position for yourself and ask a girl in marriage, you will think of me once in a while. So he's kind of saying, Theo, it's not as easy as you think. There's a lot of windy turns and you don't know what it is like to have a relationship with a woman. It is up and down. What does Tom Cruise say? It is an up at dawn, pride swallowing siege, right? He doesn't quite say that here, but he's saying, you know what? You'll realize what I've been through when you go through it. Sharon, I'm not sure I agree with you. Sharon says, I think Vincent longed for things he couldn't attain. Um, I think I think he thought that scene was a slam dunk. I also think I don't think of Margot as a sort of unattainable woman. I mean, she's older than him. She's in a way very inappropriate. Um, the problem is he's not a very eligible fellow. So no matter where he goes, he's going to be um, sort of rejected unless he starts lowering his standards and sort of looking for peasant partners kind of thing, right? I don't think I don't think he prefers a challenge. I think it's a situation where he doesn't actually belong to the middle class and he's wooing within the middle class. And he doesn't see a problem with that, but of course the middle class sees a problem with that. And in a way, they're quite right. Oh, I see what you mean. He didn't fight for her. She wasn't a challenge. Okay, that's quite interesting. That's quite interesting. Sharon, do you think that Vincent fell in love with Marguerite Gachet? Do you think he thought of her as a challenge? He goes on to say, it's true that I myself have twice met with great sorrow, sorrow of a totally divergent nature. Notice that he doesn't say three times. He says, so be it, but you will live to see that your own theory on the subject is not always sure to yield the results that one would be inclined to expect. When you have gained a secure position, then you will find a wife and children and domestic happiness. This is a beautiful promise society makes, but does society keep this promise? It's quite an interesting point. I've got to say, if you're going to indulge me for a moment, I've been a freelancer for most of my life. When I wasn't a freelancer, I was a writer. And there was a period where I had quite a few girlfriends. I was quite in love with, I was in love with the woman that I knew. I think three or four women proposed to me. Not they didn't like go down on their knees, but they were like, "Will you marry me?" kind of thing. And I sort of felt like, they weren't like, can you look after me? I was like, can I look after you? Am I going to have to quit that and do something else? And am I prepared to do that? So I just remember my financial situation being relevant to my journey. And the irony is, anyway, yeah, I don't want to reveal too much, but um, it's quite interesting what he says here. He says, when you've gained a secure position, so once you're making money, only then will you find a wife and children and domestic happiness. He says it's quite a mercenary arrangement here. It's like money equals love and happiness. But if you don't have that, then you don't qualify. So you're not a person. He says it's a beautiful promise society makes, but does society keep this promise? And I think what he's talking about is society promises that you're going to have love and happiness, are you? Are you going to have it, or are you just going to have some kind of obligation at the end of the day? He says, generally speaking, society disappoints everybody in all kinds of behavior. I say this quite good-naturedly and not by way of reproach, not at all. I don't know what that means. Bria, do you know what that means? Il y a du bon et tout mouvement énergétique. I often think, whatever that means. Let's see if we can get a translation. Translate. Are there any French speakers here? It means there's good in every energetic movement, okay? I knew about the energetic, and that did look like movement. Okay, so there we go. Theo, now that I know more than at first what made her so desperate, do you want to know what it was? That night her family spoke to her approximately in the same tone as you did to me. Well, then I decidedly lost my temper with you. That is over now. So we are getting a glimpse into things that weren't going terribly well with Vincent and Theo, right? He says she would have taken it in extremely bad part if she had my temperament. Well, the things that were said naturally, not the things you said, but what her sister said, made her so desperate and so excessively melancholy that she did what I wrote you about. So one can only imagine what her wicked sisters, almost like wicked stepsisters in Cinderella, could have said to her. You know, like, how is that going to reflect on us? And how dare you embarrass us by getting romantically involved with this tramp? You know, he's a foul-smelling Don Juan and all that kind of thing. Ricardo says Vincent does a lot of scaffolding in his relationships, building up and showcasing in a good way. Okay. He goes on to say, looking at it from your point of view, I, who am more of a philosopher, can say, at least on reflection, he now thinks that way, let him. But she, when they expostulated with her, believed she had done something frightful, and this without having done anything she ought not to have done. She took it so much to heart that she felt deserted by everyone and everything. Then, written in the margin, she's still greatly incensed by her sister's conduct, though it is subsiding. And for that matter, the sisters have withdrawn a good deal of what they said. One of them, however, goes on being sulky, and this one also tried to speak to me, but I gave her as good as I got. All yours, Vincent. Then he adds a postscript saying, I think it deeply pathetic that this woman, while she was so weak and defeated by 5 or 6 other women, so it actually seems like all of her attackers, all of her critics, all of her opponents were women. And I guess most of them are sisters. He says, I think it's pathetic that this woman says kind of triumphantly that if she had gained a victory and if she had found rest, I too have loved at last. She had never really loved before. I must say that is definitely quite sad. I think that's definitely quite sad. You kind of get the sense that this was her one shot at love. And, you know, whether or not Vincent was the ideal candidate, it's quite sad for her that she really had one little summer kind of thing. One wonders, did they smooch once, twice, 5 times? Is that the extent of her history, you know, her romantic history? As for me, these days are sometimes full of anguish, which makes me sick, which can neither be diverted nor stilled. As with much forethought, I have always respected her on a certain point that would have dishonored her socially. So I think he's kind of saying, I could have seduced her. Do you agree with that? I think he's saying, in a pretty articulate way, a pretty well expressed way, he says, I could have slept with her if I wanted to. Let me read that again. He says, I've always respected her on a certain point that would have dishonored her socially, though if I'd wanted it, I had her in my power, so that socially she can maintain her position perfectly. Excuse me. And if she understood it well, she would have a splendid opportunity to take her revenge and get satisfaction from those very women who defeated her. And I will lend her a helping hand in this, but she does not always understand, or else she understands too late. Well, so yeah, you kind of get a sense that Vincent is quite a clever, cagey playboy. I mean, he's come across as somewhat pathetic himself, somewhat naive, but now he seems to be getting quite street smart, certainly among the pastors, um, pastors and their kin, put it that way. So you could say within the pastor community, Vincent is quite a naughty boy. Anyway, okay, so going on a bit further, he says, it is a pity that I didn't meet her before, for instance, 10 years ago. Now she gives me the impression of a Cremona violin, which has been spoiled by bad bungling repairers. Now, I don't know, it's quite weird how Vincent doesn't seem particularly attracted to this woman who's quite respectable in a sense, and yet you get the sense that he was far more attracted to Scene, who was pregnant and ill and all that kind of thing. He says, and the condition she was in when I met her proved to be rather too damaged, but originally it was a rare specimen of great value, and even now she has, in spite of drawbacks, great value. The only thing I ever saw again of Key was a picture taken a year later. Was she changed for the worse? On the contrary, more interesting. That disturbing the tranquility of a woman, as theological people call it, is sometimes the breaking of stagnation or melancholy, which steals over many people and is worse than death itself. Some people think it terrible to hurl them back into life, into love, and one must consider it very carefully how far one may go. But if one does it with motives other than egoism, well, then the women themselves will sometimes get angry, may even hate instead of love. But they will not easily despise the man who did it, while they do despise the men who have extinguished the manliness in themselves. Well, those are the deep things in life. But as for anyone who does not think about them or laughs at them, Moray just calls him a dupe, and in his anger, even bete. It's quite interesting that Vincent thinks of this woman as damaged. And if you think about Vincent, isn't he quite damaged? He's been through the Borinage. He's been sort of infatuated with more than one woman who's totally rejected him. He doesn't have a job. His parents have sort of rejected him. He's been with a pregnant prostitute. Couldn't one say that he's a damaged fellow? I don't mean that he is damaged, but that he may appear to be damaged. So now another letter to Rappard. It's quite a short letter. He says, I happened to be in Utrecht last week for a day with some others from the village. I called at your house, but I could not call again as I had to go back the same day. I found nobody home at your house. I was very sorry that I could not take a look at any of your work as a result. I should have liked so much to see your large picture of the fish market, and they could not even tell me where you were, which is why I suppose you're still in Drenthe. So I wanted to see if I can find this painting, Fish Market by Van Rappard. Let's see if we can find it. It doesn't look like it. Oh, here it is. Quite interesting. Okay, so this is not Fish Market, but it is a um, a painting by him. I think it's called Brickyard. So this is the style of Van Rappard. Can you see that? Blow it up a little bit. It's quite photographic in a sense, really, really clear. It's far less gritty than Van Gogh's work. Do you guys agree? I wonder if I can find anything else by him. Anton van Rappard. There are a couple of others here. Is this one Fish Market? I think this might actually be it. This might be it. I'm not sure. This could be the painting that he's talking about. I don't know if that's a Fish Market. But this one could also be it. This is definitely a more rougher version. But this just gives you an idea of what we're sort of talking about. So he's looking at the art of this other fellow and getting a sense of his interpretations of reality. Ramasa, I quite like the bricklayer one, that first one that we looked at. That one. That's not bad. So this is obviously the kind of art that contemporaries of Vincent were producing. Excuse me, sorry about that. So he says, I should have liked at the same time to talk to you about staying with us to find out whether you feel like coming or not, or they already wrote you about it. But the two letters have not been answered. Goodbye. Then he puts a postscript. I very much enjoyed working on the 6 canvases I wrote to you about. I'm not going to really deal with it. He just talks about I'm going to put final touches on them. He says I've felt a bit cramped as I had to stick to certain fixed measurements, and also because my art lover preferred compositions with 5 or 6 figures. Despite that, I've worked on them with real pleasure, and I shall carry them still further. So we're still dealing with the second half of September, and this is a letter from Vincent to Theo. Before we go to that, I'm going to take you guys back to Nuenen, just a little bit of what it looks and feels like there. So let's just bring this up. So this is a restaurant called De Aardappel Eaters, which translates to the potato eaters. And then I showed you this sign, and it points to Van Gogh Kerkje, which is the church of Van Gogh, and there it is. And so while I was sort of walking around here, I saw the church, and then I saw all of these people in front of the church. And so I'm now walking this way, and so I noticed this car, and I saw, oh, there's a wedding going on here. And this has happened to me a couple of times while traveling. You're traveling, and then sometimes it was in England, sometimes it was in South Korea. Someone's getting married, and in the midst of your travels, you sort of stop and you realize, wow, someone's life is taking a different turn in this country that I didn't even know. And I wonder what it is like to live here, to settle here, to marry here, all that kind of thing. And so I was quite curious. So I took this photo, and then I went into photography mode, or photojournalist mode, and I started walking right up to the bride and groom. And the funny thing was, I didn't see any photographers here, and I suppose that is a photographer. But anyway, so I thought I'm gonna get a closer shot. So I went round the car, went round there, and there you can see now I'm taking these photos. And I don't know whether someone asked these people to stand here, but if you think about it, if this photographer here is taking photos and I'm in the background, I'm going to mess up the photo. So they may have decided, jeepers, he's going to mess up the background, right? Because I'm right over that part, right? So anyway, next thing, all of these people are there, and I'm now moving closer and closer. And then, well, that's actually a different photo. And I can't quite remember, but I seem to remember them saying, move on. Because I think the next step was that she's going to walk down that, not aisle, but that path and get into the car. I think she'd just gotten married and they were now coming out the church. And so I'm now the messing up their photos. Thanks a lot, Sharon. So anyway, so this picture is actually taken by the Van Gogh house, and it says here, not on view. So it's not like Graceland, you can't just like go in and walk around, right? And please do not ring. Don't ring the bell. Don't press go. Don't post. Don't collect 200. Don't come in here. Basically. Now let me take you back. So to show you where this actually is, let me just take you back. So there you can see it. It's actually there. That's actually number 26. It's really a tiny number, but there it is. Okay. And then this is a street sign, Aardappel Eaters Steegje. I'm not really sure what that means, but that part, aardappel, is potato. Eaters is eaters, and then Steegje, I don't know what that means. I don't know if it means lane, street. I don't really know. And then schilder means paint. Van Vincent van Gogh, 1885. Right. Okay. So let's go to the next one. So this is just like a village scene in Nuenen. So you just get a sense of there are a lot of tourists there. It's quite scenic. That's now a pretty big church, but it's probably fairly recent. Nice bicycle paths, quite tranquil. There's the Cafe Van Gogh that I showed you guys earlier. And I was trying to channel my inner Van Gogh, and so I was just seeing how the light was shining through this rose, quite a big rose, and bringing out all these colors, but almost creating transparent petals. So some of them were yellow, some of them were pinkish, some of them were, different colors. And then also the green as well. That's almost black. And that's, so I was just trying to channel some Van Gogh while in terms of my photography. Now, this is an actual Van Gogh painting. It's obviously a blown up section of one. And the reason I'm showing you this is just to show up close what is actually going on in his art, right? And bear in mind, he wasn't painting this way at this time. He is far from this methodology. He's not painting with so much color. He's not painting at this pace. He's not painting as fast as he is here yet. And he's not painting with this thick antipasto style, impasto style, right? And so if I go to the next one, so this was more his style. This is actually a framed actual painting of his at around the time that he's in Nuenen, right? That as well. And there you can see digging for potatoes. I think this was the Krollermoller Museum in the Netherlands. There is the potato eaters. So I actually saw the actual painting. And then there's a weaver. I think that's a sketch. There's another painting of weavers, original. Now, this is where we're going to, again, look at some detail from Vincent van Gogh. Again, notice the color in this picture. And many years later, look how much color he's now got. It's overflowing with color. There's his signature in terms of this particular execution. But this is where I want to show you just how thick the paint is. So I really had to go very close, and I actually couldn't believe that you could actually get this close to a Van Gogh. You could touch it, you could breathe on it, but you could see it so close up, and it's worth a fortune. So look at what happens when we zoom in even further. This to another section. Look how thick that is. Pretty incredible, isn't it? Onesie says Steegi is little way. Could be. So if you look at this, I think is a cypress tree, if I'm not mistaken. And if you look at how there's just one streak of white, there's another dollop of white. And yet his paintings are so coherent. They seem chaotic up close, but actually quite coherent, given what is going on here. I mean, just look how thick that is. Look how thick that is. Okay, let's go on to, I think there's one more. Pretty amazing, isn't it? So yeah, that was something I thought was quite amazing, and I thought you might think so too. So there we go. So let's go back to this letter. September 1884. Dear Theo, I could not phrase my last letter differently than I did, but I want you to know that it always strikes me as being a difference between you and me imposed by fate, rather than one for which we ourselves are to blame. You tell me that within a short time there will be an exhibition of the work of Delacroix. All right, you will certainly see there a picture, La Barricade, I guess, which I know only from biographers of Delacroix, and I believe it was painted in 1848. You also know a lithograph of Delameau, I believe. If it is not by him, then by Domo, how do you say that? Dormier, also representing the barricade of 1848. I wish you could just imagine that you and I had lived in that year, 1848, or some such period, for at the time of the coup d'etat by Napoleon, there was again something of the kind. I will not make any insinuations. That has never been my object. I try to make it clear to you to what degree the difference that has sprung up between us is connected with the general drift of society. I really find that fascinating, is the extent to which Vincent is actually interested and preoccupied with societal comments and observations. And I think it's only appropriate that he becomes this incredible artist ultimately. He was someone who was preoccupied with the human condition. And I think he understood the human condition, and that is why people today feel understood by him and why he resonates with them, right? He was trying to intuit the human condition, and he talks about the general drift of society. I'm trying to do the same thing. Every true crime case, I'm trying to find out, why is this resonating? What is happening to our society ultimately? And I think that's a very important question. If you just allow society to go where it's going, if you are seeing it happening as it's happening, there's a possibility to adjust course, to ameliorate the situation, to improve our fate collectively. We can adapt and alter our course if we know where we're going. But if you only know where you're going in retrospect, well, that doesn't do you any good. As Paddy says, looking at the bigger picture. So that's what he was doing. And he says, who were opposed to each other then, that can be taken as types of all the rest? I begin with Guizot and Louis Philippe. Were they bad or tyrannical? Not exactly, in my opinion. They were people, like, for instance, father and grandfather, like old Goupil. In short, people with a very venerable appearance, deep, serious. But if one looks at them a little more closely and sharply, they have something gloomy, dull, stale, so much that it makes one sick. Is this saying too much? So he's kind of saying, it's almost like the impetuousness of youth. He's saying, it sickens me how stale old people are, or certain attitudes are, right? We need a reinvention. We need a fresh approach. And isn't that what he comes up with? I mean, isn't this a fresh approach? Is this gloomy and stale? Or is this fresh, a fresh way of looking at things? So anyway, he goes on to say, except for a difference of position, they have the same mind, the same character. Am I mistaken in this? So he goes on to say, in short, that the one comes to a dead end and disappears vaguely, and the other, on the contrary, has something infinite. Since then, much has happened. Think about what he says there. One comes to a dead end and disappears vaguely, and the other, on the contrary, has something infinite. Well, isn't that a great description for Vincent himself? There's something infinite in not only his words, but his art. There's something, he probes something that is very meaningful and has this tremendous resonance. He says, but my opinion is, if you and I had lived then, you would have been on the Guizot side and I on the side of Michelet. And both of us remaining set in our outlooks with a certain melancholy, we might have stood as direct enemies opposite each other. I think what he's talking about here is how you don't know you're a victim of institutionalized thinking. You don't know you're a victim or a product or byproduct of culture. And how do you create culture? How do you, instead of just being the natural common denominator of a time and a place, how do you produce something original, something new? He says, now in 1884, the digits happen to be the same, only just reversed. We are standing again opposite each other, though there are no barricades now, but minds that cannot agree are certainly still to be found. Then he says something like Le moulin ni est plus mais. Sorry, I can't read that. Encore, the mill is no more, but the wind remains. Sorry, I don't speak French. Anyway, he goes on to say, and in my opinion, we are in different camps opposite each other. That cannot be helped. And whether we like it or not, you must go on. I must go on. But as we are brothers, let us avoid killing each other, for instance, in the figurative sense. We cannot help each other as much as two people who are standing side by side in the same camp. So you kind of get the idea that things aren't going terribly well with both of them. And Vincent is trying to, in a way, negotiate once again with Theo. He says, no, if we come in each other's vicinity, we would be within each other's range. My sneers are bullets, not aimed at you, who are my brother, but in general at the party to which you belong and for all belong. Neither do I consider your sneers especially aimed at me, but you fire at the barricade and think to gain merit by it, and I happen to be there. Think this over if you like, for I do not believe you can say much against it. I can only say that I believe things are so. I hope you will understand that I'm speaking figuratively. So I think that's also a really important point that he's making. If those of you who have read my book, I didn't know this, I just guessed it. I said, I'm very sure that Vincent's a very figurative painter. And when he paints, for example, the chair, that is representing him. And when he's painting, the chair in a certain way, and when he's painting another chair, that is representative of Gauguin. And it's not just this or that, he uses a color to symbolize something. So green and gold and like a dark woody color can represent richness. Yellow may represent him. Yellow is like representative of Van Gogh. But green can also be used to convey envy. I don't know if you guys remember that from my book, but Yeri is talking about it. He says, neither you nor I meddle with politics, but we live in the world, in society, and involuntarily ranks of people group themselves. Can the clouds help whether they belong to one thunder shower or to another? Isn't this a wonderfully unique way of communicating? What a wonderfully talented letter writer he is, right? He says, whether they carry positive or negative electricity. I mean, can you believe this letter's written, more than 150 years ago? It's so eloquent. It feels so contemporary in a way. He says, now it is also true that men are not clouds. As an individual, one is part of all humanity. And I think this is such a great statement. Is saying, you have communities, you have cultures that have very strict rules and they differ from society to society. And he's saying, do we belong to this little community? Do we belong to this society? Or do we belong to all of humanity? Are we all human beings or aren't we? Do we have a common humanity? He says that humanity is divided into parties. How far is it one's own free will? How far is it the fatality of circumstances that makes one belong to one party or to its opposite? Well, then it was 48, now it is 84. But try to know for yourself where you really belong, as I try to know that for myself. Goodbye, Vincent. The fact that he signs off, he doesn't say with a handshake, yours sincerely. You get a sense that there's a bit of animosity now. They're not getting along terribly well. Vincent has once again led on the family. He sort of betrayed their trust. You sort of wonder, did Theo send 150 francs and Vincent spent 50 francs worth on flowers for Margot? anyway, he says, it was mere chance that I recently happened to be asked to do a drawing or a painted study for 20 guilders. I acceded to this request, but seeing that I suspected a suspicion which on investigation proved to be well founded, that Margot Begemann was behind it all, and that indirectly she wanted to make me a present of the money, I most resolutely refused to accept payment, but not to do the drawing which I sent. So isn't that kind of a nice gesture? You know, you might say, Vincent van Gogh never, hi Stephanie, good to see you here. You might say, Vincent van Gogh never sold art in his life, or he sold one painting. Well, there were sort of niggly opportunities that he had, including his own girlfriend offering to pay him 20 guilders, but sort of through a smoke screen. So it's not strictly true that his art is only ever bought by one person. There were also, to some extent, family members and trades, and we sort of mentioned that. And so as soon as he finds out that Margot is behind this, he says, I refuse to be paid. I'll do the drawing for free. He says, it's no easy matter when one is sorely pressed for money to refuse it. He tells his brother, you know, it wasn't really easy turning that money down. He says, I would have been a pons asinorum, an underhand expedient. Instead of such underhand expedients, is there nothing better to do? I'm convinced of it. For your sake as well as mine, and for the sake of many others, I wish that we had mores in the art trade who would know how to create a new and larger buying public. So you kind of get the idea that Margot's sisters, for example, have a very shallow view of Vincent. He looks poor, he looks bedraggled, he looks pathetic. And Margot herself has gotten to know him directly, personally, and she realized, wow, this is actually quite an exceptional fellow. He looks a certain way, but he actually speaks, is very well educated. He's very interesting. He's very fascinating in just what a difficult, but nevertheless sort of direct and strong personality actually is. She's quite intrigued by him. She finds that this is a guy with personality. And she likes him so much that she tries to help him by, you know, tricking him into a commission. He goes on to say, perhaps you will say, isn't Tierstick, for instance, a moray? Maybe he is after all, but however this may be, there are still other careers to be built up, simply because the public which is buying now can be multiplied by 10, and that every day this is becoming more necessary. He talks about starting permanent exhibitions, and he says, if you are no artist in painting, then try to be an artist as a dealer. It's quite an interesting thing that he says to Theo. If you're not going to be an artist, try and be an artist as a dealer. Think as an artist, right? Think, right? That sort of thing. So he goes on to say, as for myself, though at present I'm hard up, yet I feel that within a few years I shall blithely dare to undertake running up much bigger bills for colours and other things. I want to have a lot of work to do, believe me, and I don't intend to be bored, do a great deal, or drop dead. Now, isn't that a what's the word? Him undertaking the struggle. I'm going to work hard. He says at present I'm harder, but I'm going to work very hard, and I don't intend to be bored. I'm going to do a great deal. That's exactly what he does. Where he says there, or drop dead, someone has just almost dropped dead in his life. It seems like he's saying, I'm not going to give up. I'm not going to take my life. Isn't that a reasonable thing to assume, that he's making that kind of commitment, almost a promise? Stephanie says, I will be rewatching as I see Nick shared some photographs. Yes, I did. Okay, so let's go on to the next letter. Are we still stuck in September? Late September. Dear Theo, enclosed I'm sending you 2 photographs. Later on you will get more of weavers. Now, what's quite interesting is these letters, I don't know if you've noticed, these letters are quite short. So when Vincent isn't terribly happy, then his shorters are, sorry, his shorters are letters. His letters are shorter. So he says, I intended to have 12 photographs taken, a series of Brabant scenes. I intended to send them to some illustrated papers to get some work, or at least to become known. But I've given up the idea, as the photographer only produces copies that do not render the real chiaroscuro, or hardly do. Besides, he retouches much and badly, and yet very often leaves dark what is light in the picture, and vice versa. So, yeah, Vincent is complaining a little bit about the limits of photography. However, I will have another photo taken of the weavers in carte de visite, size only, because being so far away from the illustrated papers here, I must find a means to get connections in another way than by words. Do you notice how often he refers to the weavers? It's quite a big part of his palette at the moment. He goes on to say, this winter I hope to make several drawings, particularly of the same compositions, and to send them, for instance, to the London News, which you may have noticed is now often better than the graphic. So what he's trying to do is he's trying to get sketches and, I won't say cartoons, but drawings into newspapers and perhaps magazines. He's trying quite a few different ways to become a employed or employable artist. Does that make sense? And of course he fails. Okay, thanks, Stephanie. Recently I've been working very hard. I believe what with other emotions I've even overworked myself, for I am in a melancholy mood, and all these things have combined to upset me in such a way that there are many days when I'm almost paralyzed. I cannot eat and I cannot sleep. That is to say, not enough, and that makes one weak. Again, I want to emphasize that Vincent's not someone who is necessarily going to hide his feelings. He tells his brother, I'm in a melancholy mood. He tells him, I feel almost paralyzed. He says, there are many days where I'm almost paralyzed. He says, I can't sleep, I can't eat. He says, I feel weak. Does he say any of this in the last weeks of his life? He says, I shall get over it again, especially as I have fairly good news from Utrecht. But I'm still very anxious because I'm afraid it'll be a long time before she's entirely recovered. Perhaps it'll be a long time before I get over it too. I always regret, Theo, that I'm standing on one side of a certain barricade, you on the other, which barricade is not actually visible anymore as a structure of paving stones, but which certainly does exist socially and will continue to do so. So Vincent is starting to painfully experience the reality that he doesn't belong, is no longer in the same social class as his brother or as his parents or as the neighbors. That is starting to become a reality. Now, it's one thing to say I'm attracted to the peasants and I feel their life force, and that's cool for me. It's another thing to have society say, you aren't part of us. You are dirty. You don't have a job, and so you are out. And that is what he's experiencing. And so I want to share a little story with you guys where I experienced. I actually put together a little narrative, but I'm not going to go through it now, not the way that I originally put it together. But I've also experienced that thing of you realize, wow, I actually don't belong to this stratum of society. And it's not a very nice feeling. So let me tell you a short little story. probably about 12, 13 years ago, I went to do a cycling race. I was pretty fit then, and I went with a friend of mine called Alex to do a cycling race at this beautiful hotel called the Lost City. And he took his wife, and other friends of his also went, and I took my girlfriend. And this was the situation. We were all going to have, I think, lunch together. And so the idea was that, and you could kind of check into all of the different hotels because there was sort of a check-in desk, and you could check into the lower tier hotel and the higher tier hotel at the same check-in desk. And so there we were standing, and they handed over their cards or whatever, and they sort of checked in. And then what happened was, I think they said, we don't have a record of your booking. And I was like, that's impossible. Like, I booked, how can you not have it? And now it seemed like disaster. It seemed like, are we going to have to go out of this entire hotel complex and stay somewhere else? But anyway, the hotel we were going to stay in is called the Cascades. Although it's not too bad, it was like the lower tier. They were going to stay in the Palace of the Lost City. And anyway, it just took longer and longer and longer. It was like, we don't have your booking, we don't have your booking. And Alex was there and his friends were there. And suddenly his friend just said, why don't you just take my points, so my sort of reward loyalty points, and just take a room at the Lost City? And it'll be easier anyway because we are all at the Lost City, right? It was like this really quite funny thing because he was like, he wasn't even, and I said, no ways, we can't expect you to do that. Like, you can't pay for our stay. And he was like, no, I'm not paying for your stay. It's coming out of my reward points. And, you know, I've got so many, blah, blah, blah. And so that is how we effectively got upgraded from the Cascades to the Palace of the Lost City. And so we went, and I'd never stayed there before myself. And so now we were staying with these really wealthy people, my friend Alex, his friends, and I mean, it was like living in a palace. It literally was like the suites felt like, I don't think they were, it's not like gold taps, but it felt like they were gold taps. Anyway, it just was like this incredible sort of upgrade. Everything was bigger and better and everything. And I made a joke to my girlfriend at one point. We got into a bus, and obviously full of people. And I think it was on the second day or something. And someone said, where are you going? I don't know if it was the guy driving or just a passenger. And I said, the palace. And of course, we didn't really belong in the palace, and we hadn't really paid for the palace. But it was this thing of, we are in the palace. But that in quite a snooty way, when obviously all of this had happened, and my girlfriend sort of burst out laughing. It was like, yeah, that is really it. But when we went, we had a fantastic weekend, and a lot of other good things happened. But when we drove home, I remember saying to my girlfriend, wow, um, I really realized Alex belongs to that class or whatever, and whether I want to, whether I tried to, I don't. And I found it quite depressing, quite sad, quite a reality check. It was like, and it was also like, how did you not know this or see this before, kind of thing. And I think I knew it theoretically, but to actually experience it was quite humiliating, horrible, but also in a way wonderful because we got to have this sort of experience. Another thing that was very ironic about that whole weekend was the guy who had so generously offered his points so that we could stay there. His wife happened to lose her wedding ring, I think. So she ended up having a horrible weekend because I think she spent a whole day looking for her wedding ring, and I can't remember whether she dropped it through the shower, that may have come out in the shower, or whether there's like a artificial beach at the Palace of the Lost City. Whether she was looking through the sand and so she had a horrible experience. That was like the other side. You are very wealthy and your husband gives you a big diamond ring and it's like priceless, and then you spend a lot of time literally on your hands and knees looking for it. And so I don't know, it was just quite a weird thing. I think ultimately she did find it, so it didn't end in tragedy, put it that way. But I just wanted to share that with you, that you might think, oh, this idea that you don't belong to that class, I suppose it's not really very nice. Until you've experienced it yourself, it's actually quite traumatic. And I think a movie that represents it quite well is Titanic. There's not just the painful reality that, wow, so this is where I belong. Like I'm below decks and I don't belong. I'm not allowed on that deck, and if you go there, you're treated quite roughly. But also just the sneering, insulting aspect to it that is sometimes there as well. You know how the fiancé in Titanic treats Leo DiCaprio's character in that story. He's very mean to him and very disdainful, even though he thinks he's quite a nice guy. Do you remember that? So I'm just saying, if you don't experience that yourself, you may think it's not really a big deal. Well, Vincent, this is the beginning of Vincent experiencing it. And you may also say, okay, I'm not in that class, I'm up for it. I can just accept my fate. But if you grew up in a certain class, then everything is going to be harder and you're going to kind of be pining for something that is always out of your reach. And I'm just saying it's a lot harder in reality than you think. That's all. So I just want to, I think it's important to say that so that you can understand Vincent van Gogh. It's no small pinprick. This is a sword in the back kind of thing. This is a lifelong struggle. Definitely difficult. And the amazing thing is that he's got the courage and the fortitude and the optimism and the persistence to persevere with it. That is what's really amazing. So going back to the letter, he says, let's just repeat. He says, I always regret, Theo, that I'm standing on one side of a certain barricade, you on the other, which barricade is not actually visible anymore as a structure of paving, but which certainly does exist socially and will continue to do so. When he says it will continue to do so, he's saying, I know it's going to be there going forward, right? I accept that. Then he goes on to say, in that lithograph by Dormier or Lemoud, whichever it may be, the principal subject is a person whose story I remember. There were two brothers and they were standing on the same side and both were killed one after the other for the same cause. That might have occurred in our case, but now I'm almost sure it will never happen. I, for my part, know well enough that the future will always remain very difficult for me. So again, I want to, and I'm going to do it every single time. Every time he acknowledges how hard things are going to be, I'm going to reinforce that. I'm going to emphasize that. The historians say Vincent van Gogh suffered, he was troubled, and he couldn't handle it, and he committed suicide. He could handle it. He decided to handle it. It was his choice to handle it. And he says so over and over and over again. And obviously, there are not a lot of people who decide to take this. How many people do you know who say, oh, so I'm going to be on a lower step in society. I'm going to go from one or two or three on the podium to not on the podium at all. That's fine with me. How many people do you know who do that or say that? Nobody. And so for someone to intuit this is actually what he's thinking is very unlikely. The only way you're going to figure out who Van Gogh is and his unlikely psychology is by going through his letters, as we're doing now. But who does that? Who of these art experts that think they know Van Gogh have read this obscure letter from September 1884? I mean, all the action is 1888, 1889, 1890. So you're not going to bother with, I, for my part, know well enough that the future will always remain very difficult for me. And guess what? I'm not going to change. I'm not going to try and make it easier. I'm not going to try and get a different job. I'm going to continue painting, right? I know it's going to be difficult and I'm going to do it anyway. So what is the big mystery of what happens in 1890? Things are just as difficult as they've always been. In fact, things are actually a little bit easier than they've always been. He's got more people around him. A doctor wants his portrait done. Things are actually going quite well. He's got less difficulty. But people who don't know Van Gogh just don't know how much difficulty are we talking about. What level of anxiety is normal here? He goes on to say, I'm almost sure that in the future I shall never be what people call prosperous. And so you hear when people say Van Gogh committed suicide, you know, he only ever sold one painting in his life. And some people will say he never sold a single painting. He didn't care if he did or if he didn't. I wouldn't say he didn't care at all, but it was okay if he wasn't rich. It was okay if he wasn't prosperous. It was okay if he struggled. He saw something heroic in that kind of struggle. Stephanie says, keep on, Vincent, don't give up. Okay. He goes on to say, I think that father also feels it is fatality rather than downright intention when there's sometimes such a decided difference of opinion between us. But I wish that I didn't hit other people, that father had not been standing right in front of me at times. Well, sometimes I think that at all events, painting can prevent worse things, and that otherwise it would be even worse. For the future, I have no other plans now than to continue my Brabant subjects till I'm far enough along to sell them in Belgium, for instance, or elsewhere. So, you know, where he says, I have no other plans now. Now, if you think about it, if you say, wasn't this a lesson to Van Gogh that if you want to marry someone and you're a painter, that's not going to happen. But wasn't that the same lesson he had with Kivas? And in a way, wasn't that the same lesson with Scene, which was how you're going to pay for a house and marrying this lady? Theo, I'm not going to do it. So hasn't he now gotten the third lesson of, well, you're not making any money as an artist. And so these choices you wish to make to get married to whatever, well, they're not going to happen. And yet he says, I don't have any other plans other than to continue painting. In other words, if I don't get married, if I whatever, the thing that is going to continue in the story is I'm going to keep painting. Do you see that? So again, you're going to translate that these disappointments in love and in life and say, well, were they any worse in 1888, 1889, 1890? But particularly 1890. He goes on to say, then when I have some firm footing, I should like to go back to the miners once again. Wow, that's quite a statement. He's saying, I want to go back to Brabant, the Borinage. I ask you not to sympathize with my work, but whenever you know of some resources, tell me so. Rappard has been both in Drenthe and in Terschelling again and seems to have got a good crop of studies. Probably he will come here again in October for some time. Goodbye, ever yours, Vincent. The picture of the sower is as large as that of the woman spinning. The color of the soil is neutral, but just a little pink, light green further on. The blouse of the man is blue and his trousers brown. The gaiters are dirty linen. I think in the picture the head stands out better against the sky than in the photograph. Just listen, Theo. As to that barricade, you know there was a time in my life when I stood with the Gizos, etc. But as soon as I had enough of it, you know I turned away with energy and persistence. The younger people now do not want me. However, all right, I don't care. Now, I wonder whether what he means by that is he can't find a friend his age. I wonder whether he is saying I can't find a female companion my age that accepts that I don't have any money. He says, as men and as painters, I like the generation of about 48 better than those of 84, but from those of 48, not the Guizos, but the revolutionaries, Michelet, and also the peasant painters of Barbizon. It's quite interesting that he sees himself in a way as a revolutionary, which is exactly what he is. At the time, he's kind of a revolutionary, both in terms of in terms of his own family, he's like a revolutionary, he's a rebel, right? But in terms of the art world, he's that as well. Does that make sense? Then he says, you must decide for yourself what you are going to do about it, but I myself cannot swallow everything. Your apparent indication in your letter that Goupil and Key are specialists in Millet and Dormier is really too outrageous. Do you really think I'm such a dullard as to believe such enormities? It's quite fighting language. You know, he's saying, do you really think I'm so stupid to believe something like that? In most cases, Goupil and Key lag behind with the original artists. Well, I know just as well as you what kind of fellows their protégés have been. One of Goupil's best strokes of business is that in recent years they have pushed various Dutchmen such as Maris, Mauve, and that was particularly on someone's initiative. Their having Breton is, to all intents and purposes, a separate question. But at the time when Millet, Dupré, Corot, Daubigny were young, tell me, did Monsieurs Goupil and Key concern themselves very much with them? Breton, this you know, is personally rather different from Millet and Corot, and I can well understand that Goupil and Key consider him less disagreeable as a man. Dormier, especially the way Dormier was in his earlier days, when I recall this and set against it the Guizot-like character of Father Goupil as he was then, believe me, it amuses me to think of this contrast. So he is kind of raging against the, let's call it the immorality of the art dealer mafia, let's call it that. He says, Goupil and Key has always been a bit orthodox and has been rather in the habit of looking down on other houses as if they were something better than the other dealers. Well, it was and is Tweedledum and Tweedledee. I believe that Millet and Dormier were ignored by practically all art dealers. Once an art lover said of the way the art dealers acted with Corot's studies, the excellent always escapes them. Now, isn't that a perfect description of what ultimately happens with Van Gogh? Van Gogh is sending his art constantly to his brother. His brother's a dealer at Goupil, and his brother can't sell anything. The excellent always escapes them. And there's no doubt that Van Gogh's work is excellent. I'm not saying all of it is, but that elements and certain of his work is excellent and is going to change the art world, is going to change art history. And yet at the time, this art dealership just don't seize art at all. We don't see any promise in your work, Monsieur Van Gogh, Monsieur Van Gogh, right? We don't see any potential. And then a portrait of a French doctor is going to become one of the most expensive artworks in the world. And I think at that time was the most expensive. But right now, sorry, we don't really see any potential in your work. Sorry, sir. Sometimes the industry and the institution and the experts can be sorely mistaken, right? So where he says the excellent always escapes them, the French is l'excellent le échappe toujours, 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 toujours. And this remark is shrewd. Usually their opinions are commonplace generalities. I don't know why I'm struggling to enunciate. I did narrate 2 chapters of an audiobook before this, so I'm a bit tongue-tied. Generalities, like those of Joseph Prudhomme in Monier's book. But speculating on this is tedious for you as well as for me. Goodbye. So again, it's not a very nice greeting. Oh, okay, there he did greet, so this is the second one. And then here he says, I've just read Mother's note. I'm glad you can see from it that I speak less and less to them about what is going on between us. I tell them that everything is all right, and I shall go on telling them so until I say just as succinctly that we have concluded that our affairs were diverging too much. This is true. You belong to Gupil and Key, and Gupil and Key will certainly not do anything with my work for years to come. There's another acknowledgement of what is to be expected. It's not unrealistic. Maybe he has been, but right now he's definitely smelling the coffee. They will not do anything with my work for years to come. Yeah. In the meantime, I ask you, is it possible for me to reconcile myself to making absolutely no progress, which is what you lead me to expect? There's something I want to ask you. Why doesn't Cor, that's their brother, it's quite a rare reference to him, why doesn't Cor go to Gupil's just as you and I started life when we were his age? I hear of a plan to leave him at the secondary school for a year or two longer. I hear of a luminous idea suggested in sober earnest by father of making a consul of him. And this, although nobody in this house, nor any of those with whom preliminary correspondence has been carried out about this matter, has the faintest idea what a consul actually does. So Vincent kind of seems to think his one brother followed in his footsteps, while his other brother should do just the same. Well, that's not Cor's idea or his father's idea. And it's really unfortunate in a way that Cor did go the way that he did. All things being equal, he could have had an incredible life, but his journey would bring him ultimately to South Africa and to the Boer War in South Africa, where he would lose his life under pretty horrible conditions. So this is quite sad how what he's dealing with here, how it ultimately ended. Stephanie, this letter is 1884, September 1884. He goes on to say, I'm not in the least interested in this business, but I think that this consulate is somewhat similar to the conception of the old lady here in the village, who thinks the mounted constabulary such fine fellows to look at. But I'm quite surprised. I never hear Gupils mentioned with reference to court. Why is this? Especially as you stick to them, methinks it would be the obvious thing for court to enter the firm too. And you can see how it would benefit Vincent if another brother works at an art dealer. It could sort of double his chances, right? Yeah, just to be clear, this letter is late September 1884. We have jumped a little bit forward in time. He goes on to say, later on you will be company and are helpful to each other, and at any rate he would be in a better position. learn more, see more than as a consul or in a notary's office and so on, or in the post office, all highly genteel occupations and much of a muchness. So you kind of get the idea that the older, unemployed, what's the word, brother who's in a kind of disgrace. I mean, if he came out of disgrace to some extent in February, he's sort of back in the disgrace all over again. The whole town of Nuenen not too happy about the eldest Van Gogh brother. And now the eldest Van Gogh brother is giving advice on what the youngest Van Gogh brother should be doing. Do you think Cor appreciates that? Do you think Cor is thinking, yeah, you know what you're talking about? Then he says, as for Corey himself, as far as I know, he has no distinct idea whether he would like to take up this job or that, seeing that probably he has not looked at anything at close quarters, except books, the country road, etc. And I think what he's trying to do is prevent Cor from going the same route he went, which is study a lot of theory and then be sort of shaken by the reality of the real world. As for, so he says, at present I think him a nice boy, but it is certainly time for him to do something practical, as I see it. For otherwise such fellows are apt to go to seed, particularly if they go into too dull an office. Go to seed, I mean, with respect to self-sufficiency and becoming a non-entity. So here's Vincent, and you kind of got to laugh. Here's Vincent warning that his younger brother could become struggle with self-sufficiency and struggle and become a non-entity. Maybe Vincent is sort of thinking Cor really needs to sort himself out, otherwise Theo's going to have to look after him as well, and I'm going to have to get a proper job. That could be that as well. Okay, so is there another letter in September? Okay, so this is October. So I think this is going to be our last letter. So Stephanie's just shared that one. I'm going to put the very next one there. So this is going to be the last letter that I'm going to do now. I just want to see if I can, if there's anything else I can show you in terms of these images. I think there were a couple. Okay, so before we get to the very last letter, this is a photo that I took inside a vehicle in the Netherlands. Obviously, I'm the passenger here. And I think we were on our way to the Krollemolle Museum. It's quite a nice sunny day, I believe in late May 2019. And so I was in a car, and let's just make it a bit bigger. And so I'm going to just take you very quickly through a couple of other photos. But when we go into the Al phase of Van Gogh's letters, I'm going to take you through my photos of Al's as well, as well as Saint-Remy and so on. I think I've got one or two photos of that here. I might. To be honest, I can't really remember where this is. It could be Eindhoven. I can't really remember. I know it was not far from The Hague. This was a very, very tall spire. And that just gives you a look at the Netherlands at sort of ground level. It looks like it could even be Italy. Look at all the shutters there. There's a typical Dutch gable. Looks like some pot plants at the top there. We bought some cheese over here, and the Dutch have, like so many flavors of cheese. smoked cheese, ham flavored cheese. I can't really remember all the flavors, but you just can't believe how many cheese flavors there actually are. And then this is back to the house at Nuenen. But anyway, I'll be showing you guys more photos as we continue with this series. So shall we go back to the letters? I'll be with you in a second. So I do actually have a couple more photos here. Do you guys want me to share them with you? Just a handful of additional photos. This is going to my email. So I took this photo in Enkhuizen, which is where my family lived at a certain time. These are typical Dutch gables. You've seen that one. This is just an arbitrary photo of a highway in the Netherlands. Look at these modern windmills. Of course, the Netherlands is well known for the other windmills. I think that was also taken in Enkhuizen. This was just a photo of the scene from the side of the road. You can see it's quite picturesque just from the side of the road. A farmstead. Look how green it is. This is also Enkhuizen, where my family apparently were fishermen, fisher folk. There's just another arbitrary highway shot. In some of these highway shots, you can actually see the old Dutch windmills on the side of the road. So you see the modern ones and the old ones sort of juxtaposed in a way which I thought was quite weird and quite cool. It says Amsterdam, that's directly ahead, and then go to the right there. This is a photo from home, but this is a photo I thought of sketching myself and putting real emphasis on these bright red feet of this mouse bird. So this was a picture I took, and I thought I want to turn this into a painting or a drawing. So we'll see if I do that. This is another one I took, and although it may not seem very exceptional, the idea was to create this incredible radiance, to make this into an epic picture. So although it's quite drab, these bricks, you make it into a very burnished orange light, and you turn the foliage in the back into this throbbing, pulsing, verdant background, and then maybe even beyond that, clouds that are sort of roiling, and you almost give this little bird a sort of a corona. And so you turn an everyday thing, just a little bird on the apex of this wall, into this heroic figure by use of color. And then this was a note I made when I was in the Netherlands. So just one of the notes I wrote down, and I said, the Mistral sounds like a TGV moving by, meaning the wind that I was hearing outside my window sounded like a train going by. It was the one note. And I also said, the way to understand Van Gogh is to go to Arles or anywhere he went on your own. Lost, disoriented by the old and the new and the randomness of a city grid. But I was basically just saying, if you want to understand Van Gogh's journey, go to where he went, but go by yourself. Then you'll get a real sense of it. So some of these notes I was writing with a view to writing a second book on Van Gogh, which I'd like to do, but I'm a little bit disappointed that I only have 29 reviews on the first book. And if you think about it, I've been doing a heck of a lot of publicity on that book. I've done a lot of these videos. So yeah, I don't think I'm going to be writing a second book anytime soon. Just some more notes. That's what I did on May 13. I went to the arena in Arles. I went to the bridge at Trinquetal. I went to the public gardens. And then I wrote also this note: when Van Gogh left his parents' home for the last time, it was on his own terms. When he left Paris for all, it was largely on his own terms. So just showing how his agency, his sort of self-possession kind of diminished. He was at a height of personal power in a sense when he left his parents' home, but that diminished more and more. So I wrote here, when he left his parents' home for the last time, it was on his own terms. He decided when he was going to leave. He wasn't kicked out. When he left Paris for all, it was largely on his own terms, even though Theo was about to kick him out. But in all, things changed. He did not leave all by choice. And his last journey to Orvez was conditional in significant respects. I just thought that was interesting. So, yeah, so I just thought I would share that with you guys. Okay, so let's go to the last letter, October 1884. Dear Theo, thanks for your letter. Thanks for the enclosure. Now look here. What you say is all very well and good, but as for scandal, I'm now somewhat better prepared to meet it than I used to be to nip it in the bud. So there you have Vincent telling it like it is. He's saying, scandal, schmandal, I can deal with it. Don't tell me what to do. I've been here before. It's no big swish kind of thing. No fear of father or mother leaving, for example, although they've only just received a new call. Father and mother could, if anything, consolidate their position here if they manage things properly. So there's this question of the scandal that Vincent has caused is like, are they going to actually have to leave the town? Are they going to actually have to leave this big house that they're living in? And you might think that Vincent's right. You might say, you know what, this really isn't really a big deal. They're worrying too much. Well, Vincent's father is going to be dead in less than a year. So there obviously was stress, right? I don't think Vincent's father's death was just out of nothing. I think there was a lot of stress that went into it. And I think his father died at about 60 years of age. Very well said, Paddy. Scandal is my middle name. Yeah. I hope so, Ricardo. I hope so. It doesn't have to be textbooks, but I hope someone says that guy had some interesting ideas. Just like Vincent did. He says, now there are people who say to me, why did you have anything to do with her, Margot? That's one fact. And there are people who say to her, why did you have anything to do with him? That's another fact. Apart from that, so he's still dealing with the ramifications of the scandal. Apart from that, both she and I have grief enough and trouble enough, but as for regrets, neither of us have any. So he's saying, I'm not sorry that we held hands and smooched. Look here, I believe without question, or have the certain knowledge that she loves me. I believe without question, or have the certain knowledge that I love her. Okay, I didn't really know that. It has been sincerely meant, but has it been foolish, etc.? Perhaps if you like, but aren't the wise ones those who never do anything foolish? Even more foolish in my eyes than I am in theirs. That's a great quotable quote from Vincent van Gogh. Aren't the wise ones those who never do anything foolish? Well, aren't they even more foolish than in my eyes than I am in theirs? That's my reply to your argument and to other people's arguments. I say this simply by way of explanation, not out of ill will or spite. Do you see how he can also be very measured, even when he's sort of upset? He can be quite measured and he can do it in quite a decent way, in a way. He says, you say you like Octave Murray and you say that you are like him. I've read the second volume too since last year, and I like him much better in that than I did in the first. the other day I heard it said that all Bonheer des Dames would not add greatly to Zola's reputation. This is, although we've jumped forward a couple of months, this is a second reference to Zola, and Zola would feature in a very figurative, very symbolic painting when his father died. So you can see Zola is having an impact. He's reading Zola while he's at his parents' house. He says, I consider it contains some of the greatest and best things. I've just looked it up and I'm copying out a few of Octave Moreau's words for you. Don't you think you've been moving in Bordonkel's direction during the last 1.5 years or so? You would have done better to stick to Moray. That was and still is my opinion. Save for the enormous differences in circumstances, indeed, the diametrically opposed circumstances, I actually lean more in the direction of Moray than you think when it comes to belief in women and the realization that one needs them, must love them. So he's kind of saying, I need a girl, I need a woman. I have to love. He says, Moray says, at our place, we love the clientele. Do give this some thought and remember my regret when you said that you had cooled off. I wonder what that means. I kind of think that's a reference to, that's Theo's reference to his libido, that Theo's saying, I'm not like a raging sex maniac. You know, I'm my sexual appetite or my libido is not just in check, but it's actually sort of somewhat dissipated or something. Does that make sense? Thanks, Stephanie, for sharing that. He says, I now repeat more emphatically than ever everything I said by way of bitter warning against the influence of what I called Cusae-esqueness. What a word. Cusae-esqueness. Why? Because it leads to mediocrity, and I do not want to see you among the mediocrities, because I've loved you too much, and indeed still do, to bear watching you petrify. I know things are difficult. I know that I know too little about you. I know that I may be mistaken. But anyway, do read your Moray again. Quite a deep letter to his brother. I mentioned the difference and yet the parallels between Moray and what I should like. Now look, Moray worships the modern Parisian woman, fine, but Millet and Breton worship the peasant woman with the same passion. The two passions are one and the same. So if you weren't clear about this, it's a letter about women, and I guess you could also say sex. Is it like, let's talk about sex, baby? But in the lingua franca of 1884, right? But he's saying whether you love Parisian woman or peasant woman, it's the same thing, dude. And then he has another reference to Zola. He said, read Zola's description of women in a room in the twilight, most of the women aged 30 and 50, such a somber, mysterious place. I find it splendid, indeed sublime. So he is very caught up at this point in Zola. And it's important to talk about Zola, so I think maybe now's a good time. Briefly, I'll just give you a quick description. He was a French novelist. This is a picture of him. So there he is. Let's just bring it up full screen. So Émile Zola was a French novelist, a journalist, a playwright. He was a practitioner of a literary school of naturalism, and he was a major figure, I'm reading from Wikipedia, in the political liberalization of France. So you can imagine a lot of the strident remarks from Vincent about society are actually coming from this guy. And I'm just trying to see where they. So Zola, Zola, this is a description about Zola's optimism. In Zola, there's the theorist and the writer, the poet and the scientist, and the optimist, features that are basically joined in his own confession of positivism. Yeah, so I don't really, it just gets a bit too flowery when you go into it too much. I'm just trying to find a very succinct definition of him. But in general, Zola was a guy who thought that the peasant's journey was a heroic one. He was also caught up in the Dickensian struggle, and Vincent van Gogh obviously loved that. To give you an idea, Zola was buried in the same crypt as Victor Hugo. I think that speaks volumes. I just want to see if I can find like a concise definition of his psychology. They talk about it as naturalism. Okay, so here we go. So yeah, this is something else that comes up in Zola's work. He wrote a book called Nana, and the central theme of that series is sex. Sex is all pervasive. There are themes of pleasure, desire, perversion, and it is inseparable from Zola's social theme. So is that why Vincent is so, what's the word? Is that why Vincent is doing what he's doing? Because he's influenced by writers like this. It's like, I'm reading that, now I want to do it. And so he has some kind of affair with his neighbor. And well, that's what I want to do. I'm not going to apologize for it. So anyway, let's go back to the letter. He says, to me, Malays Angelus is just as sublime, with that same twilight, that same infinite emotion, with that single figure of Bretons in Luxembourg. You will say that I am not a success. It doesn't matter to me. One is feeling and movement in any event, and they are more akin than they may seem to be, or than can be put into words. Again, I'm not a success. Well, it doesn't matter to me. He's resigned himself to that at like 31 years of age. He says, for this particular woman, it remains a mystery how it will turn out, but neither she nor I will do anything stupid. I'm afraid that the old religion will once again benumb her and freeze her with that damnable icy coldness that broke her once before, many years ago, to the point of death. Oh, I'm no friend of present-day Christianity. That's quite a statement to make, given where he is, given that his neighbor is the daughter and the other daughters of a pastor, and that his father is a pastor, that is in a Christian community. He says, though its founder was sublime, right? So he's saying, basically, there's nothing wrong with God. I'm just not such a fan of Christianity. I've seen through present-day Christianity only too well that icy coldness hypothesized even me in my youth, but I've taken my revenge since then. How? By worshipping the love which they, the theologians, call sin, by respecting the whore, etc., and not too many would-be respectable pious ladies. To some, woman is heresy and diabolical. To me, she's just the opposite. Well, there is there it is in kind of black and white. Him saying, "I'm a lover, not a fighter," kind of thing. Then he goes on. A lot of this is written in French. And it's quite strident. Look at that. I want her, I will have her. And if she escapes me, then you'll see what I do to be cured of it all. Here's a quote from Emile Zola. Can't really do better than that. Vincent van Gogh actually quoting, what means something to him. He says, "That's just acting in order to forget," muttered the other. "Well, I prefer such action. If perish we must. I would sooner perish of passion than die of boredom." That's, I think, exactly how Van Gogh, that meant a lot to Van Gogh. Van Gogh, I think, really took that to heart. I would sooner perish of passion than die of boredom. And didn't he? You guys that have read my book, The Murder of Vincent van Gogh, do you think he did perish of passion? And you know what it's related to? It's related to women, right? That's what it's really related to. He says, "It is not only I who say this, but she too, and instinctively so. That's why I saw something grand in her from the very beginning. Only it's a confounded pity that she allowed herself to be overwhelmed by disappointments in her youth, overwhelmed in the sense that her old-fashioned religious family felt they had to suppress the active, indeed highly gifted element in her, and so rendered her passive forevermore. If only they hadn't broken her in her youth. If they'd left it at that instead of once again driving her to distraction. Oh, Theo, why should I change? I used to be very passive and very gentle and quiet." That's true. He was, wasn't he? I agree, Stephanie. He says, "That I am no longer, but then I'm no longer a child either now. Sometimes I feel my own man." So you do get a sense here that he's starting to make quite big decisions. They're still possibly rash, but he is taking responsibility for it, and he's saying, um, "Sorry, that's my decision. I'm doing it consciously. I'm happy with who I am and what I'm doing, even if you're not." Then he says, "Take Mauve, who is quick-tempered and difficult to get on with at times. I haven't come as far as he has, but I too shall go further than I am now." Well, you will, Vincent, you will. "I tell you, if one wants to be active, one must not be afraid of going wrong. One must not be afraid of making mistakes now and then." What a great statement that is. So true. If you want to change the world, don't be afraid of making mistakes. Many people think that they will become good just by doing no harm, but that's a lie. And you yourself used to call it that. That way lies stagnation, mediocrity. Also a great statement. A lot of people think, and I used to believe that myself, that you could get to a place that was meaningful and important. I don't mean in a prestigious way, I just mean for you personally in your personal journey, by avoiding mistakes, by avoiding harm. But that's not how you learn that. You've got to make mistakes. You've got to go into the unknown. You've got to make a fool of yourself. You've got to struggle. You've got to be embarrassed. You've got to be foolish. And then the more you are, the more you learn. Um, the more you learn. And there are so many people who are afraid to make mistakes. So if you are brave enough to say, "I'm going to just make mistakes all over the place," then you may actually transcend a lot of ordinary people who are stuck in that place of, "Oh, but I'm too scared to make a mistake." Well said, Terry Dean. The greatest fear we have is fear of failure. Onesie says we need both light and dark to grow. Yeah, it is great life advice, definitely. So let me reiterate. He says, many people think that they will become good just by doing no harm, but that's a lie. And you yourself used to call it that. That way lies stagnation and mediocrity. Now, I think if you take that out, if you take that part out of the sentence, it's quite a strong sentence where he says, if you just say, many people think that they will become good just by doing no harm, but that way lies stagnation and mediocrity. That way is a lie. Just slap anything on when you see a blank canvas staring at you in the face, like some imbecile. You don't know how paralyzing that is, that stare of a blank canvas is, which says to the painter, you can't do a thing. The canvas has an idiotic stare and mesmerizes some painters so much that they turn into idiots themselves. Many painters are afraid in front of the blank canvas, but the blank canvas is afraid of the real passionate painter who dares and who has broken the spell of you can't once and for all. So again, really incredible statements that he's making here within this scandal scenario. He's kind of saying, I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid to fail. I'm not afraid to paint. I'm not afraid of the canvas. And I can tell you as a writer that I've been, I don't really want to say afraid of the blank sheet of paper, but certainly I've always remembered Stephen King's words, which is don't come to the blank sheet of paper lightly. And I know exactly what he's talking about, is that you don't just sit down and write. You've got to find whether it's a gravitas or a zone or a point of entry, but you've just at least got to acknowledge that there is a point of entry. And for a painter, I can imagine it's even more difficult because, you know, it's easy to type a couple of words and now you've begun your story. It's so much harder where there's a big canvas and that canvas has got to be filled with something that's going to be cohesive and make sense and be something you're not going to want to throw away. And each time, once you've done that, you put another one there. There's something different, I think, about, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but I think there's something different about writing where you start right. Once you started, you just go, you get into a rhythm. I don't know if painting is the same way. I don't know if once you've made the first stroke, the rest flow. I don't know. Maybe sometimes. But um, I think what he's saying here in a way is he's saying, I've achieved a certain confidence as an artist, and that's what matters. And I'm happy with that. And it's really not that long from here that he's going to produce the Potato Eaters. So what he's saying here isn't empty. It's not like banging a drum. It's not empty words, it's not noise, right? He's starting to come into his own psychologically as an artist. A lot of the tools that he needs, he's assembled. And I think the final barrier, if that's the word, is in a weird way his father. Once his father dies, Vincent goes out into the world and the rest is history. He goes on saying, life itself, too, is forever turning and infinitely vacant. He's saying life is the same. Life is the same as a blank sheet of paper for a writer, a blank canvas for the painter. And all of us are, you know, if you're hearing this, you're alive. If you're hearing this, you have the same thing that is awaiting you and challenging you, which is you wake up tomorrow and life presents itself and tomorrow says, what are you going to do with this day? What are you going to do with your life? Right? That in a sense is also like a blank canvas. Tomorrow's Monday. What are you going to do with Monday? What are you going to do with this week? What are you going to do with this month? What are you going to do with this year? It's the same question. And he says, you know, that time presents an infinitely vacant, dispiriting blank side towards man on which nothing appears. That's why I say your job is to say, just add meaning. Well, it's like, yeah, it's as simple as that, but it's also as complicated as that. just add meaning. Yeah, that's all you've got to do. But what is meaning? You're going to have to figure that out. And maybe certain things that are meaningful now won't be meaningful later. Maybe you're going to find out that your fairy tale isn't really that meaningful. I'm starting to wonder, do I really like riding a bicycle so much? Is it really that fun and that meaningful? I'm not going to answer that question just yet because I think I need to suffer some more and continue on that journey some more, but I'm certainly asking that question. Are there other things I could do, like hike around one of the world's highest mountains or hike the Appalachian Trail? Do I have to ride a bicycle in circles when you can move in other ways? He goes on to say, no matter how vacant and vain, how dead life may appear to be, the man of faith, of energy, of warmth, who knows something will not be put off so easily. He wades in and he does something and stays with it. In short, he violates, defiles, they say. Let them talk, those cold theologians. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm very touched by this. I'm like, wow, this is a wordsmith in his own right that is writing this. This is someone who's a kind of a teacher, kind of a master. You might say, yeah, but he doesn't even have a job. But he's discovered part of human truth. And that is what I think Theo recognizes, and where Theo thinks, I need to kind of hang on to my brother. Something interesting is happening here. If anything, I'd like to see how the story ends, right? Good point. Tommy says he is becoming Vincent. He says, Theo, I feel so much confounded pity for this woman just because her age and just possibly a liver and gallbladder complaint hangs so threateningly over her head. And this is aggravated by emotions. For all that, we shall find out what can or what fatally cannot be done. However, I shall not do anything without a very good doctor, so I shall do her no harm. This seems like, in a weird way, a very long rant to say, I'm going to decide what I'm going to do. Don't you tell me what to do in terms of this woman. And I do think, I don't know if it's true with women as a man, but I do think a big way that people grow up is when they fall in love, and the way that they have to take responsibility and accountability and action based on, for example, the sexual impulse. I think that is where you realize I can't really, and I mean this just in a human way, I can't really rely on God for the answer here. And what I mean is, if you are aroused or attracted or whatever, I don't know whether you can necessarily say every single time, every single moment, God, what should I do? I think there's a moment where you say, this is my life and my life is mine, and I must decide what it is I want. I can't always have someone else pull my strings. I am me, and I must act in some way. And I'm not saying you never think those thoughts. You never think, what is the moral issue here? I'm just saying at some point you ask yourself, or you tell yourself, I need to act because of this is who I am, or not. And I think in a big way, that thing separates you from your parents, your siblings, your family, and you realize, well, I must now make a grown-up decision. And I'm sure all of you have come to that point at least a couple of times in your life where you've had to say, I can't rely on anyone else for what I'm about to do now. I must decide whether I'm going to do it. I must decide whether this is the time and the moment and whatever, right? So I'm just saying that's a great area, I think a very critical area where you find yourself. And I think if you don't, then how are you going to find yourself? And I think this is happening with Vincent. While we're almost at the 3-hour mark and this letter's almost finished. Anyway, so he says, just because I anticipate that if our road should lead us to one and the same place, we might have strong differences of opinion. For that very reason, I don't want you to be able to hold my dependence on you against me. He's very conscious of that, and it is very true and it is very real. Theo, I don't want you to be able to hold my dependence on you against me. Now, can you see, to some extent, Vincent is becoming psychologically independent? Do you agree with that? He's financially dependent, but he's becoming psychological, and that's important. He's becoming psychologically his own man. He can think for himself. Yeah, I think we all have, Stephanie. He goes on to say, I'm still in two minds about what I should try to do, but in all probability, I shall not be staying on here. And the question will then be, where to? So this is September 1884, and he will end up staying on for quite a few more months. And of course, when he leaves, that will be following another, not a scandal this time, but kind of a tragedy. But this time I don't want to jump to that point. I think we need to work our way to the potato eaters. I think we need to follow his artistic journey a bit further. What I've tried to do in the way I've narrated this is try and take the journey into his journey with relationships. I've tried to juxtapose Kivos, Scene, and Margot, so you could see that kind of in a line. And if you have too many letters in between, it sort of distorts that. So I wanted to make that quite clear. Now I think we're ready to sort of go back into the art for a while and see how does he evolve at this point, this seminal point where he really seems so self-possessed, to have such great agency. How does he progress in his letters, in his thoughts, in his words, to the point where we get to the potato eaters? Now, bear in mind also, when he produces that, he gets criticized. Well, how does he deal with that? Does he have this mastery over himself that he seems to theoretically have here? Or is the mastery that he's talking about here just something he's reading in books? Is this really Zola talking, or is it Vincent talking? So I think you'll agree with me, these letters, but particularly this one, are it's one of the best letters we've actually dealt with in 26 episodes. Anyway, he says, so he's now already talking about leaving, and he says, but where should I go? He says, I don't think you'll be pleased about my coming to Paris. And I don't know if you guys know this, but he will ultimately go to Paris and arrive on Theo's doorstep without even asking him, without an invitation. He will just arrive there. Surprise! So anyway, he goes on to say, but what am I meant to do about that, since you refuse point blank to look after my interests? All right, but for my part, I can't possibly leave things as they are. Had you written less peremptorily that it was beneath you, I should never have given it a thought. But now, well, now I must go my own way. In short, I have no wish to barter the chance, be it no more than a chance, of making my own way for the certainty of a patronage that is somewhat confining. Since I can see that I am forfeiting my chance of selling by continuing to take money from you, we shall just have to go our separate ways. So again, this is Vincent being real, and he's saying, look, I think this is the end, Theo. Right? You can see this is a pretty deep letter. Then he says, don't you think it eminently reasonable that hearing you say that you won't be able to do anything with my work for the next few years, there's a little bit of a glimpse into what Theo is telling him, and he's right. He says, I get the feeling that there's a marked contrast here, that while you stand on your dignity, I, precisely because I don't sell, no matter how hard I work, am forced to say, Theo, I'm 25 guilders short. Couldn't you see a way to letting me have a little bit extra, which then proves to be impossible? What is so very contrary about you is that when one sends you something or one asks, please try to find me an opening with the illustrated papers so that I can earn something. One hears nothing in reply, and you do not lift a finger but one is not allowed to say, I can't manage on the money. Up to now, at any rate, but things can't go on like this. And I should like to add that I shan't be asking you whether you approve or disapprove of anything I do or don't do. So it's kind of like reproaching Theo while at the same time saying, don't tell me what to do. And then he says, I shall have no scruples. And if I should feel like going to Paris, for example, I shan't ask you whether or not you have any objection. And that ends up being exactly what he does. He says here, if I should feel like going to Paris, I won't ask you, and you won't have any objection either. And so that is as far as I'm going to take it. The next letter, I guess, is somewhere in October. But I would imagine, let's just have a look at how many letters are written in October. Let's bring it down. So let's just locate ourselves on this grid. We now at 1884, right at the bottom here. And we are now in October, just 4 letters. So you can see the scandal happens here. We've jumped from that letter. We've skipped all of that. We might come back to it later on, when the series is concluded. But you can see the letters are now starting to trickle in, 4 letters, 5 letters, and so on. And now we go to the next year, 1885. This is the year that he leaves to go to Paris. 5 letters, 3, 2, then quite a few letters. But after that, look at that. And it's around this time that he's in Paris. And then there's like nothing, no letters. And he's in Paris effectively for about a year and a half. Sorry, he doesn't go straight to Paris. He goes to Antwerp, and then he goes to Paris. And then this period here, he's in Paris. Look at that, no letters at all. And then look at that. Look at all of these letters in 1888 and 1889. So anyway, that's where we are right now. Okay, so I hope you guys have found this episode quite interesting. I did go to a lot of trouble, which is why I was 15 minutes late, but I didn't want to get those Weaver pictures out. I wanted to have sort of 3 dimensions. The Weaver story, the photos that I took when I was in Nuenen, and then the jumping to September part of the narrative. I wanted to surprise you guys with it, just so that you would be unprepared. I wanted it to be a bit of a feel quite fresh. So let's have a look at your votes. Margot Begemann was Vincent's neighbor, and 43% say that she was the daughter of a pastor, while 43% are right. How many of you guessed? How many of you knew the answer there? Come on, be honest. So what I'm going to do tomorrow for the next episode in terms of the Van Gogh, sorry, sorry, I'm just a bit distracted here, of the Elvis series, I'm going to be looking at what the most important women in his life have said, and there's really some fascinating content there. So I'm really looking forward to that. So that'll be sometime tomorrow. Stephanie says, I guessed right. Well done. Okay, so the mods that are here, Stephanie, I don't know if Sharon is still here, but the mods, the members, also the new members, thanks very much for being here. Are there any super chats? Okay. Well, if you're listening to this in replay or on replay and you found this episode interesting, useful, whatever, and you want to show your appreciation, you're welcome to do that. I think this was a pretty incredible, the letter we've just gone through now. I think it adds some amazing quotable quotes, but it just is a pretty profound letter from the great artist. You can see he is definitely finding his feet, right? Tommy says, I never know any of the answers to the polls. Well, Tommy, you must do what Van Gogh said, make mistakes, and you'll eventually get there. Stephanie says, are super chats or thanks better? Well, super chats if you honor live, thanks if you are coming later, that sort of thing. Thanks a lot, Tommy. Thanks a lot. Also, for those who are on Patreon, I've put up the first 2 chapters of an audiobook, and this one is quite special because my sister is narrating the female characters' statements. So that's something I haven't done before, and hopefully you guys will find that quite interesting. So she quite enjoyed it. We had quite a good laugh. So yeah. Okay, guys, thanks for being here. If you in America, take care, stay cool. I don't know if there's anyone here from Kentucky, but we certainly keep them in our thoughts. Some quite serious floods in Kentucky, and people are going through a difficult time there. So we definitely have them in our thoughts. Wanzi, thank you very much. I hope you do, Stephanie. Cool. Okay, guys, thanks very much. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday, and I'll see you guys next time.